Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. In our town, everyone had heard about the tall man, or as he was also called, the long-armed man. This was something like a local legend that over many years had grown from scary stories into almost anecdotes. And of course, every storyteller who respected himself could tell countless stories about how he saw the tall man in the garden, in the forest, and even in his own basement. However, on this topic, I tried to listen only to restrained people, not inclined to excessive chatter, from which I formed my opinion about the long-armed man. In the town I spent my childhood, more precisely, that part of it that fell on summer vacations. The town was like any town, nothing special. Old houses, plenty of elderly people, well-maintained gardens, small shops, and the old main road that was overgrown with weeds and dandelions. What always attracted me was not there, but 10 miles to the north, beyond the fields and beyond the strip of old forest. It was a swamp. In my conscious age, I visited there only 3 times, and each time it made an increasingly oppressive, and at the same time some supernatural impression on me. It always looked different. The first time it was more like a clean forest lake. The second time it was covered with a disgusting green film. But I remember the third, last time most of all, when the swamp appeared before me as a huge field of fog, from which hundreds of sharp peaks of tall reeds stuck out. It was from here, according to all beliefs, that the tall man came. It was there, as people say, that his low, powerful breathing could be heard at night. They described him differently. Some claimed he was like a long dried tree, and his arms, like lifeless whips, dragged behind him on the ground. Others gave him similarities to a primate. Supposedly he walked like a gorilla, leaning on the ground with large fists. Still others claimed that he didn't walk at all but crawled, occasionally jumping like a frog, but pushing off with his hands, not his legs. They also argued a lot about his appearance. He was attributed long tangled fur and slimy snake skin. Generally, if there was a grain of truth in these stories, it was impossible to find. Only in one thing did everyone agree, and rumors repeated each other. The long-armed man always came only after sunset, and always only watched. He never ran, never attacked, and never performed any actions. He just watched. Absolutely silently, frozen like a statue. He simply stood somewhere in the distance and stared at you. And no one ever tried to approach him during such encounters. People never clearly saw his face, muzzle, or whatever he actually had there. But they still felt a gaze that penetrated right through. Usually, it was enough to simply turn around, or even briefly close your eyes. And the tall man was no longer in that place. The disappearance of any livestock or vegetables from gardens was primarily attributed to the long-armed man. Although there were never any prerequisites for this, and most often the lost cows and goats were found after a few hours of searching in the outskirts. No one remembers when he first appeared, no one first saw him. Cases of his appearance had no logic or pattern. He was seen both in snowy winter fields and during sultry summer nights. No one noticed him drinking or eating. No one found tracks, even such as simply trampled grass. Taking off my camouflage pants every few minutes, I made my way through the dense birch forest. A brand new expensive camera hung pleasantly on my neck. I often stopped to photograph huge anthills, clearings of yellow flowers, colorful mushrooms, and other forest trifles. Meanwhile, the joyful summer sun here and there peeked through the tree crowns, showering me with warm rays. Here and there, green and gray lizards scattered from under my feet, and around flowers of all kinds and colors, bees busily flew. Gradually, step by step, the forest began to change imperceptibly. The trees became lower, more crooked, and thinner. The soil began to get softer. The birds and flowers remained somewhere behind, along with the cries of orioles. When the sun reflected in smooth, mirror-like water, I felt a little uneasy on my soul. Perhaps a person has some primal fear of such water bodies. We're always more pleased to look at a restless river that's in constant motion, while standing water surrounded by reeds and tufts of green grass evokes some melancholy mood in a person. The stillness of this water evokes gloomy thoughts, and you don't want to look into it at all. What beautiful photos these would make. Having spent several hours there, and greatly regretting the absence of rubber boots, I used up almost all the camera's charge, but was proud of myself. I anticipated a sensation on my Instagram. An excellent play of light and shadow, the rhythm of greenish water pleased the eye. Leaves abundantly scattered on the surface looked like a chaotic pattern on glass, and any branch sticking out of the water gave an almost perfect reflection. And what if after this some magazine contacts me and wants to include my work in their article? Why not? What if they generally offer me a job? They'll look at what a skilled young specialist I am and snatch me up with both hands. What if it turns out that carefully examining my photos at home, I discover that in each of them, somewhere in the corner shadows, sits the long-armed monster and looks into the lens? That would just be a sensation. From the last thought, I felt somehow uncomfortable. I lowered the camera and looked around. Only now did I pay attention to how quiet it was here, and for the first time, I felt some anxiety. I looked at the sky and saw the sun that wasn't yet leaning toward sunset, but obviously intended to soon start its evening movement toward the horizon. Packing the camera in its case, I involuntarily strengthened my feeling of anxiety, casting one last glance at the endless swamp, and headed toward the town. While I walked through the squelchy earth, various stories about the tall man crept into my head like snakes. I remembered how one cocky boy proudly assured everyone that he had driven the tall man away from his path, shouted at him with profanity, and then even ran after him. This brought me little relief. But then I remembered a young woman who also told about an encounter, but this time without embellishments. I remembered the sincere fear in her eyes, and from this, anxiety again stirred in my soul. I didn't want to turn around. I wanted to just get to the asphalt road, to the town, to pass by people faster. But my body thought otherwise, and hearing a crack of a breaking branch a few meters behind me, I instantly turned toward the sound and froze in place. I peered into the tree crowns. There was nothing there. No movement was felt. I shifted my gaze to the thickets. Also nothing. Probably just a branch broke and fell. That can happen. For some time, I struggled with wanting to get out of here as quickly as possible, and not being able to force myself to turn my back to the swamp. Along with this, another feeling washed over me in a wave, much more unpleasant than during filming. The feeling that I wasn't alone here. From this thought, a chill ran down my spine. After hesitating a bit, I chose the second option, turned around, and noticeably quickened my pace. And then, calling myself a coward, but promising to keep this secret from the whole world, I simply ran. When I arrived in the town yesterday morning, one very sad news awaited me. In the 5th year of complete loneliness, my old country house couldn't withstand winter and collapsed inside, turning from a crooked hut into ruins. Although I was tired as hell, and my feet, unaccustomed to long walks, were burning and covered with blisters, I couldn't just pass by it. Like yesterday, I stopped and looked at the fragments, feeling like some kind of traitor and betrayer, as if I had forgotten something beloved and warm, and remembered only when I lost it. Of course, this land still belonged to me according to documents, and my distant relative and neighbor, old Edgar, gladly accepted me to stay for a few days. But looking at the pile of broken boards and some iron pieces, I felt as if my last connection to childhood had collapsed and rotted under spring rains. I forced myself to forget about sad thoughts and decided that one day I would restore everything here, and headed to the neighboring house to old Edgar. In my modest opinion, his house was the pearl of the old town. Not the biggest, not the richest, but obviously the most beautiful. The whole thing was in Edgar's hobby. He was a wood carver with golden hands and used them at every opportunity. He made fences, gates, doors, even paintings. His work was often ordered even from the city, and he was always only happy with new work. The dark village twilight had already fully entered their rites. I sat down on the bench in front of the house, and deciding to rest a little, took out a pack of cigarettes and lit up, examining the house. Even in the half-darkness, I could see that the gate supports were made in the form of wooden idols, and the doors themselves were decorated with patterns of wooden daisies. Even the distant scarecrow in the garden wasn't just a stick in rags with a bucket on its head, but a tall statue with narrow shoulders and a hunched back. The arms, in turn, were decorated with wooden birds under a highly carved sun. What talent! Tomorrow I'll arrange a photo shoot here. No more forests and swamps. Meanwhile, old Edgar came out and, sitting on the bench next to me, became interested in where I had been wandering all day and all evening. Promising to surprise him with photos, I threw away the cigarette butt and we went to the house. At midnight, having spent time chatting and with dominoes, sleeping soundly and satisfying my hunger with scrambled eggs and sausage, I, as I had promised myself, photographed the house from all possible angles. Also, to Edgar's displeasure, I forced him to take out old works and put them in a bright place. Besides Edgar's wonderful creativity, I walked around the garden and photographed bushes and trees. I was just trying to find the right angle when I noticed one oddity. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an oddity that gradually began to deprive me of peace and annoy me like a buzzing in my ear. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I called Edgar and, pointing to the potato field, asked, "Where's the scarecrow?" In response, Edgar looked at me and sarcastically asked what birds needed to be driven away from potatoes. I smiled in response, but then I was struck as if by lightning. I did see a scarecrow yesterday. There could be no doubt about this. I even went and sat on the same bench, took the same pose. Nothing the empty garden, no scarecrow. My mood changed rapidly. I didn't start inventing theories about optical illusions or that Edgar was just playing with me. All my assumptions were unlikely except for one, the most obvious. I saw the long-armed man. No lies and no inventions. He really exists. Edgar approached me with a worried face. "Jake, what happened? Got heat stroke?" he politely inquired. "No, everything's fine. Why did I turn pale all over?" "Listen, Edgar." I looked into his eyes. "I think I saw the long-armed man yesterday evening in your field. I took him for a scarecrow." "Now that devil," Edgar laughed. "Well, nobody ever saw the tall man during the day. You imagined it, probably. And I didn't see him during the day either, and not in such places I used to walk. But I didn't see him during the day, but yesterday evening on your field. I took your scarecrow for him." Edgar turned to his garden, squinted, and then sighed. After being silent for some time, he said, "Well, you saw him, so you saw him. Why worry about it? When I was young, also walked in places where you don't walk. Consider yourself lucky, Jake. When I was little, I didn't have to meet him. But now, surprisingly for us, you noticed him, while he was like that. Edgar, how many of you have seen him at all?" "Not many." 4 times or 5, and only in the lowland," Edgar said with some regret. "And how often is he generally seen here?" "Well, no. Sometimes 3 months will pass until someone meets him, and sometimes he appears every week. The devil has no schedule. Faina, rest her soul, once told that the tall man came to her garden and looked at her through the window." Edgar jokingly twisted his finger at his temple, laughed, and patted me on the shoulder, heading back to his beds. "Faina, and what happened to her?" "I haven't seen her since the year before last," I asked him in pursuit, but Edgar had already left and seemed not to hear my question. I didn't want to repeat it. The first 15 minutes I tried to give this incident a positive coloring, but I couldn't. One thought persistently climbed into my head, and I couldn't drive it away by any means. The thought occupied all consciousness and grew to obsessiveness. Some unpleasant fear spread through my stomach, and nerves began to unpleasantly prick in my neck and shoulder. At first, I just looked around distractedly on all sides, then got up and decided to walk around the town. From the side of the street, I carefully examined every garden, every house, looked into the gaps between trees, carefully climbed onto a pile of some concrete blocks, and looked from there. I saw nothing, and somehow this didn't bring me relief. 2 facts wouldn't give me peace. I looked at the tall man. He looked at me. I cannot notice the tall man, not even think about his presence, and he sees me. I returned to Edgar's house and spent the day somehow, hiding my nervousness. When the sun set again, I said I wanted to take a few photos of the night town, took the camera, and went out the gate. I deliberately didn't take a flashlight with me and headed to walk around the town once more, realizing that at night looking into every crack made no sense. I just walked and turned my head in all directions, sometimes stopping and listening to every sound. Nothing. I walked the entire route, went to the asphalt highway that was on a hill, and opened a wonderful view. It didn't interest me. I returned to the house, then again to the highway. Nothing. The camera reminded of its presence only by hitting my ribs when my step quickened. Realizing that this was more like madness than an evening walk, I rubbed my face with a handkerchief and decided it was time to go to sleep. I saw the tall man on the ruins of my old house, He sat like a huge cat on the piece of roof that remained and looked at me from above. In the moonlight, I saw his silhouette, a tall, hunched figure with narrow shoulders and long, thin arms. I felt no drop of life in him, as if it really was a scarecrow. I was fascinated by this sight, touched by something unusual. I immersed myself in a mystical trance. All this lasted no more than a minute, until the barking of dogs at the other end of the town brought me back to reality. I wanted to run, but I managed my instincts, realizing that I would curse myself for the rest of my life for a missed chance. Trying not to hurry, not taking my eyes off the roof, I felt for the camera on my chest and slowly pulled it out of the case. My photographer's instincts played a mean trick on me this time. I automatically lowered my eyes and began choosing the night shooting mode. In a second, I realized my mistake. The roof was empty, somewhere behind the house. Branches rustled barely audibly, and only now did real fear come. With all possible speed, which at night threatens injuries, I ran to Edgar's house. During this time, I managed to understand one thing. I wouldn't stay in this town even for one night. Bursting into the room where Edgar was preparing for sleep, very apologetically for the rush, I told a quickly invented story about how the next exam was moved up, and I needed to be in the city by morning, and asked to open the big gates so I could drive out. Edgar had nothing left but to sadly sigh, take a promise from me to come after the exams, and go look for keys. In 5 minutes, I was already driving on the asphalt road. My gaze again opened to the entire town. It was beautifully bathed in moonlight. For some reason, I really wanted to look at it again. Fear was receding, and adrenaline was pulsing weaker somewhere in my neck. I muffled the engine and got out to smoke. I wanted to think. He was somewhere there, the long-armed man. He didn't come from swamps. He was always in the town. Why didn't anyone understand this? In broad daylight, he disguised himself well and watched people work in gardens, watched them visit each other, watched them work in gardens. He looked at all this, and only he knew for what purpose. And when night fell, he came out of his hiding places to get closer and continue watching through windows. Only then did he become less careful, and only then did people sometimes notice him. But not often enough. From these thoughts, I was distracted by the rustle of grass and no wind. I looked at the overgrown field that was once probably the pride of the collective farm. Earlier, they probably processed many varieties of cereals here, fed the whole region with this, and now the field was completely covered with weeds and burdocks, and the tall man was crawling through it toward my car. Probably I was the first to see him in motion. Perhaps I interested him more than others. He wasn't hiding much. Maybe this was his usual manner of movement, like a dog that sneaks, carefully placing each of its 4 paws. I didn't wait for him to come out on the road. I just jumped in the car and pressed the gas. In the mirror, I saw how he accelerated, ran a few meters after me, and then stood on 2 legs. Not like a human, rather like some gopher. That's not how he stood. He stood until he disappeared from my field of view. Now when I understand that the long-armed man was watching me when I was a child, it makes me uncomfortable. What did he need? Who is he at all? How long has he been living next to people? And most importantly, what happens to those who interested him more than others? However it was, I try to preserve warm memories of those times. about our house in the village, and about Grandma and Grandpa. Every summer, my sister and I spent with them. I remember Grandma as a tall, plump woman in a colorful apron who from early morning was busy in the kitchen. And by evening, the table was full of meat pies, boiled potatoes with dill, borscht, salads, jam of any taste, and other dishes in such quantity that an ordinary person simply couldn't eat. Grandpa was tall and strong for his age, an old man with a huge gray beard. In his youth, he had been a respected hunter, carpenter, and simply a master of all trades in the village, to whom people still turned with various orders even from the city. I was a little afraid of the gloomy and taciturn Grandpa, but he was like that only on the outside, because at the end of the day, he invariably handed my sister and me colorful candies, bird's milk, or white marshmallows wrapped in packets, the sweets that my parents often spoiled me with. When Grandpa wasn't fixing something in the yard and wasn't digging the garden, he liked to lock himself in his garage, which served as his workshop, where he crafted furniture or engaged in his mysterious old man's affairs. I loved our village house, despite the fact that the TV there didn't catch channels with cartoons, and instead of a comfortable bath and shower, there stood an incomprehensible, always dark building on the plot. But there was a wide, endless field there, the edge of which was gilded by the setting sun, and on which it was good to lie hiding in the tall grass. There was a swing set up by the village children, and a big pond for swimming. There was the gray cat Smokey and colorful cows that wandered the village without any supervision. There was, of course, also the forest. Not a shabby city park littered by alcoholics and bums that you could see through, but a dark, dense, real forest. One in which the tops of spruces cover the sky, and no matter how hot the summer day with heat, under their cover it always smells of dampness and mushrooms. The forest was our favorite place. Grandma and Grandpa categorically forbade going there, but who and when could this stop? We could walk in it for hours, collecting cones and finding all sorts of adventures. I remember that during that period I read the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and told Amy the story about the yellow brick road, the same one that led to the magical city on whose towers precious stones shone. Of course, I presented this not as fiction, but as absolutely true truth, and that the road paved with yellow bricks was hiding somewhere in our forest. I even found an empty vodka bottle, broke the neck, and got a glass ball from there, saying that this was a real emerald. I remember that at that moment Amy's delight knew no bounds, just like the stream of tears when the ball was lost a few days later. My little sister was delighted with this story, and I didn't dissuade her. On the contrary, on warm summer days when we walked through the forest, I continued to tell tales, the plot of which had long gone beyond the good fairy tale and was filled with inventions I made up on the go. Mostly increasingly gloomy and scary ones about monsters and traps waiting on the path, about black people who walk on their heads, or predatory trees that lurked by the road and eat little girls. I don't know why I did this. From mischief or simply from boredom, or maybe I liked the fascinated look of my younger sister, who looked at me from below with admiration. Amy was 3 years younger, a naive, silly girl ready to believe that the moon is made of Dutch cheese. She listened to me with an open mouth, and I was incredibly pleased with myself. This continued until I got bored. Soon I got bored with Amy too, and the village, and the forest, and even the huge field with the setting sun. No, I continued to love my sister and grandma and grandpa. But at 14, other priorities. Evening parties with friends become a much cooler activity than collecting cones in the forest. Those who are younger suddenly start seeming like stupid kids to you, and you imagine yourself almost an adult who wants completely different things. You want to rebel and break prohibitions, walk until dawn, or hold hands with that cute girl who started flirting with you so coquettishly during breaks. Gradually, Amy and I drifted apart from each other. After all, I was older by whole 3 years. What are 3 years actually? It's a trifle, but when you're a teenager, 3 years is not a gap across which bridges are built. My sister still remained a child, and I had already crossed the mysterious Rubicon, behind which adult life beckoned seductively. Naturally, this also affected trips to the village. For me, they simply stopped because I already knew how to be hysterical and stand my ground. But for Amy, as before, they remained mandatory. I don't know what kind of trick my parents had regarding these village vacations. Probably they just wanted to rest from us, and therefore sent us to the old folks for the whole summer. Only now Amy went alone. But former delight, these trips no longer caused in her. With the approach of summer, she became anxious, often listened to parents' conversations, pretended she had a temperature. I saw a horned person in the forest, she once said, but I, of course, just waved it off. This is now I understand that she behaved strangely. But in those days, I noticed nothing. More precisely, I simply didn't care. If I hadn't been such a selfish, brainless jerk, I probably would have heard the little bells that were enough. They slipped either in Amy's frightened look, or in her trembling shoulders, or in torn phrases that time and again broke against our indifference. Little bells that foretold a terrible end. Little bells that something was wrong. The peak of this something wrong was a phone call that broke the night silence of our apartment. My parents were always hard to wake up, but I was hit as if by electric current, and I woke up. I rushed to the corridor to the telephone device. Amy was calling. Her voice was quiet but firm and somehow adult, which immediately made me anxious. "Mike, wake up Mom and Dad. Let them come get me from here," I heard in the receiver instead of a greeting. Half asleep, I couldn't collect my thoughts for a long time. I stood and couldn't answer anything for a long time. "Mike, wake up Dad. Call him to the phone," clearly and consistently Amy repeated, as if she were an adult and I were a child. And she was explaining something simple and obvious to me. This sudden role reversal even offended me. Without trying to understand the situation, I decided to snap back. "What's wrong with you? It's night outside. I won't wake anyone up. What do you need?" "Just wake up Mom and Dad," Amy repeated irritably, and after a short silence added in a trembling voice, "Someone is walking around the house, looking in the windows. It's the horned monster from the forest. Mike, wake up Dad, please." I don't know why I acted the way I acted. Maybe I considered Amy's story another fiction, or I was an adult only in my own imagination. And actually, I was scared to wake other adults. Or maybe resentment played in me for the fact that some little girl dared to order me around. But I did nothing. I told Amy to stop making things up, said that she dreamed it all, said she should go to sleep and not call at night. said something else because of which the silence in the receiver changed to hysterical crying. Then only some last words that no one heard. In the receiver, short, dry beeps sounded. I stood a little and put down the receiver, passed by my parents' bedroom, and returned to mine, where I covered myself with a blanket over my head. Stupid girl dreamed a nightmare, I concluded with absolute confidence, and fell asleep. I slept easily, and no dreams came to me. Those days are remembered in my memory vaguely. I remember that Mom cried silently in her bedroom, and I was interrogated by an investigator. I remember that for several days I was in some kind of emotional stupor, and then I had a hysteria, and my parents had to call an ambulance. The doctor who came gave me some injection, after which I immediately fell asleep. That night, for the first time in a long time, I had a dream. I dreamed of the yellow brick road. Amy was never found. Not the next day, not in 2 days, not in a week. Senseless summer days flew by. School bells rang in the corridors. New Year greetings were fought out. A Christmas tree and tangerines. January blizzards thundered. Buds bloomed on trees. I turned 17, and adult life awaited me ahead. Amy was forever left at 13. She disappeared without leaving even a trace. The police long considered the kidnapping version, but eventually settled on the fact that Amy, for some unexplained reason, ran away at night and got lost in the forest. Finding a living person in a dense forest is difficult. A dead one is sometimes simply impossible. Even my parents gradually came to terms with it, but I didn't. The May sun warmed the leaves that had broken through on the trees when I told my parents that I wanted to go to the village that summer. My parents exchanged anxious glances, and Dad, who was smoking on the balcony, choked on smoke. And with the same persistence with which my parents had tried to send us away earlier, they began to persuade me to stay. But at 17, I was a certified stubborn donkey. The meeting turned out warm and at the same time awkward. Grandma began to hug, and from excitement, instead of Mike, called me Mitch. The slightly withered, but still vigorous grandpa firmly shook my hand. We sat drinking tea, and I, as in childhood, was enchanted listening to the silence outside the window and watching how sunbeams danced on the walls. Then I threw my bag with things in the small room that Amy and I once shared. 2 neatly made beds that used to take places along the walls. When I unpacked and laid out my things, I didn't pay attention to the box in the closet, and from a clumsy movement, it overturned, and the contents scattered on the floor. There were hairpins and ribbons, funny slippers with flowers, colored markers, dolls. Amy's things that the old folks had carefully packed, but apparently forgot to send home. I felt a heavy lump that rolled up to my throat, got on my knees, and began carefully putting them back. And only then I noticed that at the bottom of the box lay a book. It was a worn edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which, judging by its appearance, my sister had read to holes. Unwanted memories flooded in. I sat on the bed and for a long time turned the book in my hands, helplessly wandering my gaze around the room. My gaze stopped on the only window, and my body shivered involuntarily. I had somehow completely forgotten that the room's window faced the forest. The whole next day I devoted to walks around childhood places. Here nothing had changed on the one hand. On the other hand, much had changed. Someone had cut down the tree with the swing. and the pond where we once swam with such pleasure seemed to me just a swampy puddle. The gray cat Smokey had died of old age, and the village children weren't visible. Probably they, like me, had stopped coming here. Only the forest remained the same as I remembered it, always mighty and dark, one that pulls the sky to itself. Moreover, it had managed to extend its coniferous paw to the abandoned plots. The village itself, which seemed like a space for travel in childhood, was actually a tiny village that barely had a dozen houses. The closest to us was Grandma Rose's house, a pious, quiet old woman. Further lived deaf Grandpa Mark, behind him Grandma Grace, whose cows didn't give peace to the village residents, wandering the street and trampling gardens. Aunt Nancy with her husband, the owner of the only grocery store in the village. A few more close and distant neighbors, whom I either didn't know or no longer remembered their names. Well, and of course, Uncle Tony himself. Uncle Tony lived at the opposite end of the village from us, and in childhood, Grandma and Grandpa strictly forbade approaching him. I often repeated this name to myself after Amy disappeared. Uncle Tony was the youngest resident of the village, although he was already under 50. He had a reputation as an avid fighter, but more of a drunkard, poacher, and criminal. An evil person whose biography is quite typical for a dying post-Soviet village. Lack of work, vodka, drunken fights, 2 prison terms, return, and everything anew. After Amy's disappearance, the police first of all took on Uncle Tony. However, he, as they say, had an iron alibi. He had spent the whole month in the city and hadn't appeared in the village. At least, that's what the investigator decided. In Uncle Tony's yard, a mangy German shepherd almost broke loose at me, foaming and running along the stretched wire to which the chain was attached. I walked around the squalid house several times, fenced with a fence behind which murky windows and a neglected garden loomed. On this, my detective activity ended before it really began. The disgusting dog followed me everywhere. I moved away and sat aside, taking out a pack of blue Winstons and lighting up. The excitement that preceded the trip had subsided, and realization of the senselessness of what was happening began to roll over me. What did I generally want to find here? Did I seriously plan to climb into his house and find a basement there with a torture chamber? With anger, I ground the butt into the ground, turned around, and headed away. On the way, I saw Grandma Rose in the window. I stopped and friendly waved to her. The old woman didn't respond. She probably forgot me in a few years. Then I smiled, pointing to my house, but she suddenly crossed herself and pulled the curtains. I felt a little uncomfortable. That night I slept anxiously. I was bothered by the change of place, fresh air, and a draft from the window. Moreover, Grandma was clattering dishes in the kitchen all evening, then rattling something in her room. But even when everything quieted down, I didn't feel better. I tossed and turned from side to side for a long time, and only far after midnight finally managed to fall asleep. I woke up sharply from an incomprehensible feeling of some danger. As soon as I opened my eyes, I immediately screamed. I hit the back of my head against the headboard of the bed. Above me hung a motionless figure, looking at me with an attentive gaze. Her eyes dimly gleamed in the darkness of the room. "Grandma," I whispered, trying to cope with my heart that was beating frantically. She was in one nightgown, and I suddenly understood why she always wore a headscarf on her head. Grandma was almost completely bald. From her small head, covered with wrinkled old bird skin, hung several worthless gray strands. She froze motionless like a wax statue by the head of my bed, and her eyes drilled me with a frightening light. "Grandma," I repeated in a trembling voice. "Mitch," she finally whispered hoarsely. "I have a horned head in my room. She hides under the bed again. Lately, she's been smelling very badly. Won't you chase her away, Mitch?" What was all I managed to say. Instead of an answer, Grandma slowly turned around and shuffled to her room. I jumped up, hastily pulling on my pants. In Grandma's room, there was a mess. The wardrobe with clothes was overturned upside down, and photographs had fallen from the shelves. Grandma pointed her finger at her bed, covered with a beige bedspread, the edge of which hung down to the very floor, covering the space under it. "There," she said, "I got so scared." I listened, tried to talk to Grandma quietly, but she was silent, not taking her frightened gaze off the bed. The bedspread barely swayed above the floor, whether from a barely noticeable draft or from something else that I didn't want to think about. We stood in complete silence for several long minutes. I felt my mouth go dry. The silence, the unknown, and Grandma's strange behavior were stretching my nerves into a tight string. At some point, I couldn't stand it. I grabbed a broom in the corridor, returned to the room, and then sharply pulled the edge of the bedspread. Under the bed, there was no one, only a thick layer of dust on the wooden floor. I sighed with relief, turning to Grandma, but she was looking at the dirty floor with fear and surprise. I made the bed again, and despite her elderly protests, put Grandma to sleep. I checked Grandpa's room. In recent years, the old folks slept in different rooms, and made sure he was calmly lying covered with a blanket over his head. Then I went out for fresh air and smoked. I needed several deep drags to calm down a little. What the hell just happened? The whole next day, I felt out of place. I wanted to watch Uncle Tony, who left the house with a duffel bag on his shoulder and went somewhere toward the forest, but I almost immediately lost him from sight. I remained standing at the edge of the forest, angry, sleepy, scratched by bushes. At home, I tried to question Grandma about yesterday, but she smiled guiltily and waved off the conversations. "I dreamed it, Mike. Grandma is old already. You forgive me. I scared myself and confused you. You better eat. Come on, eat." I sat at the table while Grandma bustled around, putting homemade tomatoes on plates. She was again in her colorful headscarf. However, now I knew what was under this headscarf. A bald skull covered with yellowish wrinkled skin and surrounded by hair remnants. Pathetic hairs resembling thin cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. For some reason, this image stuck firmly in my head, causing disgusting nausea, which made me lose my appetite completely. Grandpa wasn't there. He woke up and had breakfast very early and again locked himself in his garage. From there came sounds of working tools. Grandpa didn't come out to greet me in the morning, as he didn't come to dinner yesterday. In the evening, his garage seemed to be the only thing that interested him. "This horned creature took Amy," I said aloud unexpectedly for myself, and Grandma dropped the pepper shaker from her hands. Instead of an answer, she moved closer to me, leaning her wrinkled face directly over my plate. My nose was hit by an unpleasant grandmotherly smell. "You lock the window in your room in the evening, only not with curtains." I'll give you an old blanket, good, thick. It's still from my mother. And don't go out into the yard at night. I'll lock the front doors, don't be scared, dear. Well, why would you go out there at night? You better read books. The TV is over there, look, stay at home. Only don't disturb Grandpa at night. He needs to rest. He has a sick heart. And mainly, kiddo, don't go for walks in the forest. You forgive us old folks, she added after an awkward pause that hung over the table. All grandparents have their oddities. You're not angry, right? I wasn't angry. I just locked the door of my room and tossed and turned restlessly on the bed, not knowing what to do with myself. Anxiety intensified as darkness approached. Judging by everything, Grandma didn't even plan to go to sleep and again was rattling something in her room. I heard sounds of falling objects and moving furniture. After suffering from doing nothing for an hour and a half, I finally tried to fall asleep, but almost immediately jumped up when loud hammer blows came from her room. Running through the corridor and opening the door, I saw how Grandma was standing on a stool and trying to nail a huge picture torn from the wall over the window. I had always remembered Grandma as neat, who wiped dust twice a day. And now her room was in real chaos. Literally everything was overturned upside down. Moreover, I had to immediately cover my nose from the disgusting smell that hit my nostrils. Of course, since the toilet was outside. If I could still handle my business by going through the window, being locked in the house at night, then Grandma was helped only by a night pot that stood next to the bed and trembled from every sweeping blow. From these same blows, its contents gradually splashed onto the floor. Hastily, I closed the door, returned to my room in complete confusion. Now it was clear why Grandpa spent all his free time in the garage, and at night covered himself with blankets over his head. Grandma was probably sleepwalking. I heard that this happens at their age, and it's supposedly not scary. However, I immediately remembered Amy, and I felt terribly ashamed. If a healthy guy like me got scared to hell yesterday, then how was it for my sister to spend whole summers in these walls? I sat on the bed, taking out The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from the box, but I had no mood to read. I just quickly flipped through the book, and it opened to a random page, revealing fields written in clumsy children's handwriting. Forgetting about the rumbling from Grandma's room, I began to carefully study them and saw more notes and more. These were short notes, children's funny drawings, naive thoughts. Apparently, Amy's favorite book also served her as some kind of diary. I involuntarily smiled when I saw notes about our legend, the yellow brick road. Of course, there was nothing special here, just guesses and fantasies of a little girl. But the last entry was fundamentally different from the previous ones, forcing me to tense up. On the page was a color illustration depicting the well-known plot. Dorothy, Toto, Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion walking along the yellow brick road. Only the faces of all characters, like the road itself, were painted over with black. And below in the same black letters was written, Underground. I looked at this ruined drawing for a long time, so I didn't immediately pay attention to some symbol drawn nearby. It was incomprehensible and quite complex. A long winding line decorated with strokes, circles, and some scribbles. I had never seen anything like this before. I flipped the book to the very end, but this was the last entry. The find excited me. I got up and began pacing the room. Of Of course, this was almost nothing. An empty clue, a small trifle. But obviously, this was the only thing Amy left before she disappeared without a trace. Underground. I had goosebumps running down my spine. I went to the window, opened the casements, and nervously lit a cigarette. A cloud of gray smoke slowly dissolved in the darkness of the night. Ahead, a black wall of forest loomed, illuminated only by the pale light of the growing moon. I peered into it with anxiety. It no longer seemed like the magical and fairy tale place I remembered from childhood. And in the dying out of my heart, I watched how the tops of pines swayed, listened to how branches cracked and trunks creaked, as if something in its depths was constantly stirring, rustling, and moving. Moonlight broke through the branches, creating a bizarre weaving of shadows. They swayed and crawled under the roots like living ones. But I knew this was an illusion, imagination, darkness. Therefore, at first, I didn't pay attention to the figure moving through the forest. A tall human silhouette slowly and silently glided between the pines and walked into the thicket. On his head, 2 short growths were visible, similar to horns. I was so struck by his unkind, piercing gaze that I froze in place, staring. Not even because he had left his yard to come out onto the street on such a day. And not because he was somehow standing behind our fence and looking into our yard, but because of the strange hatred in his eyes. At some point, the figure stopped and froze in place. Then it turned a little, and I realized with a delay that it was now looking in my direction. Fear came to me, and it fell with a paralyzing cold wave. I cursed and immediately extinguished the cigarette, not understanding that I was perfectly visible in the lit window. I stepped back, grabbing the shutters, and with horror realized that all these windows and doors were just dry wood chips, old boards unable to protect from anything. Mike, I recoiled as if scalded and fell to the floor. Grandma was banging on the door of my room, locked with a latch. Mike, I have eyes under the floor. They're looking at me through the cracks. Drive them away, please, Mike. Having jumped to my feet, I ran to the window. But the horned silhouette was no longer visible, just forest, just shadows from moonlight. My heart was wildly pounding. Mike, they're knocking on the floor, disperse them. Please, Mike. My name is Mike. Mike, I snapped, throwing at the locked door the first thing that came to hand. Did you see someone at night in the forest? Grandpa unexpectedly stopped me in the corridor when I was about to flee from the house that had become unbearable. Caught off guard, I silently nodded, and he leaned over me, staring into my eyes with 2 cloudy eyes, one of which was half covered with a cataract. Grandpa's stone face expressed no emotions. Now I saw him very close and understood that actually Grandpa looked bad. Exhausted and thin, even withered. In his neglected beard stuck bread crumbs and dead insects. At that moment, I thought that the disappearance of his granddaughter had hit him hard, and Grandma's frightening sleepwalking would soon finish him off completely. Since I remembered him, Grandpa had become even more taciturn and reclusive, increasingly immersing himself headfirst in work and preferring it to the company of fellow villagers. He never went to the forest anymore, neither for berries, nor for mushrooms, nor for game, and didn't even look in its direction. Under Grandpa's piercing gaze, I felt uncomfortable, and I, frightened, shook my head frantically. Grandpa didn't take his eyes off me. You can't let them see you. Do you hear? Hide, watch, walk behind me. I've seen them. I'm looking for a moment to get closer. They have a second skin. He suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me almost close to his face. I was hit by the smell of sweat and rotten teeth. His fingers dug into my shoulders. I felt strength atypical for his age and frailty. Remember, they can take it off like clothes and put on a new one. They take off their skin and put on another one. They take off skin and put on another one. They can look like anyone, like you, like me, like your mother or your father, and you won't tell the difference. You can't let them see you. They'll follow you until they catch you off guard. Grandpa squeezed me in his iron embrace, and I stood neither alive nor dead, afraid to utter even a word. But this is our house, our home. Who will drive us out of here? Your sister knew this, and for this she was taken. Don't go to the forest, obey Grandma, don't disturb Grandpa at night. But mainly, kiddo, don't go walking in the forest. Without waiting for an answer, he left the house. I remained standing in the corridor, where the smell of food from the kitchen mixed with the smell of urine and dirty linen from Grandma's room, which even closed doors couldn't contain. I mentally counted to myself 3 days. 3 days I had been here, if you count the day of arrival itself. 89 days of summer awaited me ahead. I returned to my room and began throwing things into my backpack. Then I spat and went to the corridor, tearing the gray, greasy telephone receiver from the wall, and dialed our apartment number. Long beeps stretched the wait into infinity. I cursed, hit the lever, and dialed again. Nothing. My parents, as always, were impossible to wake up. I felt tears flowing down my cheeks from powerlessness, and in anger, I smashed the receiver against the wall. In my room, I feverishly began collecting things, just grabbing the first things that caught my eye, stuffing them into my backpack. I ran to the exit, but stopped at the very doors. I still had hope that this was some kind of delirium, just a coincidence of circumstances. It silently went out as soon as I entered Grandpa's room and lightly pushed the body hidden under the blanket. A straw scarecrow fell to the floor. I ran into the forest. This was probably a bad choice at that moment, but in my ideas, the road made too big a detour. And if you go through the thicket to the west, you can reach the river, cross it at the ford, and there to the neighboring village is just a stone's throw. There's a district police officer there. Let me figure out what I need to go through the forest, but the forest is just a forest. I ran quite a bit when I heard the crack of branches and noise somewhere to my left. I immediately accelerated, but it very soon turned into heavy stomping and hoarse muttering that sounded somewhere behind my back. In the light of the full moon that came out from behind the clouds, a white skull crowned with a pair of short horns flashed between the trunks. I screamed and rushed with all my might, but from the horror that had overwhelmed me, I only clung more to branches and slipped on grass. The pursuer was rapidly approaching, and I literally felt his presence behind my back. To my ears began to reach terrible wheezing whisper. "Who are you? Who are you? Show yourself. Come here, filth, I'll look. Who are you? I'll see what's under the skin there. I'll look at you. I'll take off your skin. I'll take off your skin. I'll take it off." I squeezed all the air out of my lungs, turning it into a cry for help. But somewhere in the corner of my consciousness, I already understood that this was the end. At some point, something roughly pushed me, and something sharp stuck into my side. I fell headfirst to the ground. Breathing became unbearably difficult. It was painful, very painful. The next events I remember only in fragments. A terrible rumble that tore the night silence, then the pale face of Uncle Tony leaning over me. He was bustling around, tearing his t-shirt into parts, and his hands were stained with blood, probably mine. Then Uncle Tony squeezed me in his bare embrace and carried me somewhere for a long time, and I saw the barrel of a shotgun swaying behind his back. Then there was light. Some people, doctors, conversations, ambulances with sirens, white ceiling. And all this merged into one colorful firework of images without details. And somewhere far in the forest, dragging his shot legs behind him, crawled the one I could no longer call my grandfather. I understood this when, having passed through the underground tunnel, I found myself not in the lair of a forest monster, but in our own garage. In those days, I didn't yet know such words as dementia, acute schizophrenic disorder, twilight confusion, and other terrible terms. I only know that the first changes were insignificant and almost imperceptible, attributed to ordinary old age oddities, amplified by loneliness. Later, they turned my grandmother into a madwoman who rattled around the house at night, and forced my grandfather to put a bull's skull on his face to hunt those who don't sleep. I was incredibly lucky that on that very night, Uncle Tony decided to check his cash with something not very legal. Lucky that the wound turned out to be shallow, and I got off with a light scare. Lucky unlike Colin Glass, whose skinned remains I found in the garage. Grandpa had always been a good hunter, and even in madness didn't lose his skills, lucky more than my sister. Even as an adult, I never tried to find out whether among all these garages, basements, tunnels, and hideouts, which they then found in abundance, they found her mangled body. Because I was afraid to hear the answer, and for everyone, it was obvious anyway. The old folks' village house was burned by someone from the locals, but we didn't grieve for it. Both were taken to a psychiatric hospital for the rest of their days, and neither I nor Mom and Dad ever tried to maintain contact with them. Even when death certificates came one by one, I just threw them in the trash. This is probably wrong, because a sick person isn't guilty of what they do, no matter how terrible their actions. Maybe they weren't good parents, but I wasn't a good brother either. Twice a year, I come to my sister's grave, where from the photo a girl looks at me who will forever remain 13, and I ask myself the same question. Who is to blame for what happened? But I can't find an answer for myself. Every summer vacation I spent in the small, cozy house of my grandparents. It was located right on the outskirts, not far from the exit from our town. Sometimes it seemed to little me that my elderly relative's house was located at the very edge of the world. In that area, not many people lived. Only 2 stores operated with all the essentials, and about a computer or internet in those days, you couldn't even dream. But despite this, I really liked spending time there, and I waited for each summer with impatience. In my head, magical memories still sparkle like fireworks about how we with local boys and girls played outside from morning till evening, went swimming to the lake, had picnics, and engaged in many other children's activities. However, there was a place near our house that all locals tried to avoid by taking a different road, the veterinary clinic. They built it approximately in the mid-'80s, shortly before the Chernobyl accident. It was a huge 3-story building that was divided into 4 wings. For some time, there even operated a specialized laboratory, the only one in our entire state. They conducted experiments there and looked for ways to treat various animal diseases. In the best years, all the first-class specialists flocked there, and the institution gradually developed. This lasted, unfortunately, not long. After the collapse of the Union, the times came that you know yourself. Funding was cut, the laboratory was closed, and research was curtailed. Later, somewhere in early September '93, a fire occurred in the veterinary clinic, as a result of which several people died, and almost all the animals perished. The fire broke out either due to someone's negligence or due to electrical problems. This is not known for certain. According to my grandmother's memories, the fire was extinguished for a long time, but not until night itself. And the news about this tragedy shook our entire town. To this day, the veterinary clinic stands empty. Everything valuable that didn't reach the flames was long ago stolen in the '90s. Since then, that place was considered unclean and gradually began to be overgrown with various legends and tales. Among the children, there were also many rumors about the terrible clinic. I still pleasantly remember how we gathered with friends in the evenings by the fire and began to tell stories about all sorts of ghosts and dead people who supposedly wandered there. Each time we tried to decorate these tales with new details and particulars. And you know, in those times, they scared us much better than any horror movie. Of course, all these legends only fueled our interest in the vet clinic, and despite all the prohibitions of adults, we still secretly went there. In those ancient times when I still wore a funny yellow cap and pants with Mickey Mouse, we with my friends already knew every corner there, exploring another abandoned wing, floor, or warehouse. I felt like an explorer from adventure books who got into wild jungles and goes deeper and deeper into their impenetrable thickets. Then this place seemed interesting to us, and we felt no fear of it. But very soon, everything changed. This story happened to our company in July. I remember then I went with Alex and Andrew to the veterinary clinic as usual. That summer, we visited there especially often because we were building our own headquarters in the garden nearby. In search of various useful things for it, we often had to rummage through slippery rooms that miraculously survived after the fire. And that day, we also decided to engage in this matter. Taking backpacks with us, we began to search the huge warehouses one by one. Inside, everywhere, a thick layer of dust, an unpleasant alcoholic smell that I think I'll remember until deep old age, and heaps of garbage awaited us. In the corners, everywhere lay piles of broken bottles and cigarette butts, and next to Soviet inscriptions on the walls, graffiti caught the eye here and there. On our way, we mainly came across abandoned medical equipment, animal cages, and all sorts of other junk. That day, we weren't lucky to find anything useful. So finally, we decided to climb into the veterinary clinic building itself. Time was flying fast, and the sun was already beginning to lean toward the horizon. Then we were talking cheerfully about something on the 3rd floor of one of the wings, when Alex suddenly called out anxiously, "Hey, look here." He stood by one of the few surviving windows and pointed somewhere down. Approaching him near a tall apple tree, we noticed a girl about our age. She was dressed in an old-fashioned blue dress and pretty white shoes. The last rays of the sun reflected on her golden hair and small cheeks. The girl was waving her arms at us. "Who is that?" Andrew asked in surprise. "Guys, is this by any chance not Tiffany?" "No, that's definitely not her," Alex sharply objected. "Tiffany left with her parents to the seaside a few days ago." "Girl, are you lost?" Andrew loudly addressed her, but she didn't answer anything. Meanwhile, her movements became more and more lively. The girl began jumping in place and waving her arms even more actively. She resembled a person who got into big trouble and was calling for help with all her might. Her face and small cheeks turned red. It seemed like a little more, and the girl would simply jump out of her pretty white shoes. "Maybe she's very scared," Alex suggested. "Listen, we'll come down to you now, okay?" In response, again not a word. In a moment, all three of us headed to the first floor, going down the soot-covered stairs. In my head flashed a thought that this looked quite strange. This little girl and her nice outfit somehow didn't fit at all into the gloomy surrounding landscapes. And what was she doing alone here among century-old ruins at such a time? Shouldn't this girl be home already? In these thoughts, I didn't notice at all how we approached the exit. When our trio found ourselves on the street, the girl was still standing in place. In the evening twilight, her face seemed gloomy and stern to me, like a strict father with a belt in his hands who was about to punish his disobedient son. The girl no longer waved her arms and didn't jump in place. Andrew and I moved toward her, but at the same moment, she darted off along the grown path by which we boys had come here. We immediately rushed after her and began calling loudly, but the girl didn't respond. I swear her speed at that moment could have been envied by any Olympic runner, and we boys could barely keep up with her. My heart was beating a frantic drum rhythm. Branches were scratching my face, and somewhere ahead the blue dress flickered barely perceptibly. At some point, I caught my foot on a root and fell painfully to the ground. Andrew and Alex returned to me, and we completely lost the girl from sight. Her silhouette disappeared right behind one of the turns that led to a high hill. When we reached there, the girl was nowhere to be found. Behind that hill immediately began ancient suburban houses, so I thought that maybe she was local and lived in one of them. By that time, it had already become quite dark, so having scratched our surprised heads some more, we boys agreed on this very thought, and with mixed feelings went to our homes. The next morning, I, as usual after breakfast, went to watch TV. Outside was wonderful weather, and the sun was shining pleasantly outside the window. Grandpa and Grandma went to town, so besides me, there was no one at home. Turning on the box, instead of the morning Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, I stumbled upon a local news channel. On it, a host in a suit with a worried look reported, after a long 6-month investigation by law enforcement officers, a serial maniac known by the nickname Tomahawk was detained at the site of the abandoned veterinary clinic. This turned out to be 37-year-old Dmitry Ostapchuk, a mechanic from one of the local auto services. The man was caught around midnight during an attempt to commit another murder. All details are being clarified. A pleasant chill ran through my whole body, and my bones felt as if dozens of small spiders were simultaneously crawling along my spine, right under my skin. For a long time, Tomahawk had been something like an urban legend that I had repeatedly heard from friends at school. Periodically, stories about his crimes appeared in regional TV news. This scoundrel had long stalked his victims like a wild beast on the hunt, as described in newspapers, after which he attacked them with an axe, preferably in the dark time of day. He committed his last massacre about a year ago, and after that seemed to have vanished into thin air. The police thought he had fled or gone into hiding, but no. A minute later, they showed a photo of the killer on screen. At first glance, this was an unremarkable man with a swarthy face, gray eyes, and a sparse beard. A typical provincial maniac. Then in the frame appeared the victim, a tearful middle-aged woman who was telling something to numerous journalists. But I almost heard nothing. The announcers' voices sounded somehow distant and muffled. Everything was covered with a thick layer, and a lump rolled up to my throat. And all thoughts in my head mixed like paints on a mad artist's palette. Suddenly, I also remembered the mysterious girl we saw yesterday with Alex and Andrew. I was even scared to imagine what could have happened to us if we hadn't run after her then and had stayed there. I'll tell you more. I'm ready to give almost anything just so I never find out. The next days, terrible thoughts about the fact that in place of that unfortunate woman could have been us. That maybe that sick freak had even seen us and was watching us, were climbing into my head. I tried to drive them away from myself, distract myself, engage in some affairs. But they still returned like annoying flies to spoiled meat. That summer, we boys no longer went to the abandoned vet clinic. Our headquarters was captured by guys from the neighboring street, but we deeply didn't care about this. About that little girl, we tried not to remember anymore. Then near my house, they finished building a brand new stadium. So we spent the rest of the vacation there playing basketball and football. The only thing that reminded us of that place were tales heard by the edge of the ear from other boys. But this is still not all. At the end of summer, cleaning up the house, I stumbled upon a pile of old magazines and papers under the bookshelf in the living room. Among this pile of waste paper, my attention was immediately caught by the headline of one of the newspapers: Major Fire at Veterinary Clinic. The issue number was dated September 6th, '93. Taking it in my hands and glancing a little lower, I froze. Among many photos of those who died that day, placed to the right of the text, my eye immediately caught a black and white photo of that same girl. On it, she was dressed in a white blouse and was sincerely smiling. From that article, I learned that her name was Martha Henderson, and at the time of death, she had barely turned 11 years old. She was the daughter of one of the veterinary clinic workers and studied at the local specialized school. On that terrible day, her father took Martha from school to work because there was no one to leave her with at home. When the fire started, the girl was trapped under debris and couldn't call for help because she was mute. Years passed. We took Grandpa and Grandma to live with us, and we decided to sell their house. All my childhood friends, including Alex and Andrew, had long moved to other cities. Despite the fact that a lot of time had passed, I often remember that little girl. I think that she, or rather her ghost, might still be wandering those old and forgotten by everyone clinic corridors. And although I couldn't find answers to many of my questions, I know one thing for sure. That July day, the spirit of a girl named Martha Henderson saved 3 children's lives. If you ever see something rectangular or cross-shaped on the horizon while traveling, especially if it wasn't there before, I have some advice. turn back. Don't run, and especially don't photograph it on your phone. Don't call anyone. Try to behave as always. Just turn back and preferably retrace your exact steps. Walk in the opposite direction, don't speed up, and behave naturally. Look somewhere straight ahead at the sky, but under no circumstances turn around. Usually no one will call out to you, don't worry. But inside, one treacherous feeling will play an unknown feeling until now. What if I get away with it? No, 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 never again. Just walk. Even if there are only a few minutes left to your destination, walk half the city if necessary. Make whatever detour your imagination is capable of. This might help. This is the first and possibly the only rule I learned. I anticipate your questions and will start from the very beginning. I'm exactly 30 years old now, and what my name is doesn't matter. Since I was 15, I've had to follow one iron rule, thanks to which I managed to keep my life from the edge of what collapse. I don't know what kind of collapse, and I have no desire to check, to be honest. There are moments I won't talk about yet, so as not to turn my story into confusion. But when this returns, you need to be very vigilant. These warnings can and should help. I'll say right away, they didn't help me. My case is somewhat different. For others, this lasts naturally for a little over a month, and I haven't yet had the opportunity to measure this duration. But from my first memories, it's a month plus or minus a week. If we're already talking about first memories, then we should probably turn to them. In childhood, I was sent sometimes to my grandparents on my mother's side, sometimes on my father's side. One lived in the coal mining region, the other near Clarksville, not far from the town of Meadowbrook. It was in this town that my childhood passed. That's where this whole story begins. A little later, on my well-celebrated 15th birthday, my friends and I took Grandpa's old Camry for a ride. At first, everything went fine. Although the road in town and beyond its borders was pothole after pothole, driving slowly worked out. Grandpa himself had taught me to drive earlier and promised to give me the old but still vigorous car in a year. But then I wanted to speed up a little, and on the first turn, the car flipped over on a barely noticeable bump. The gas tank leaked, the wheels went in different directions. A couple of friends had fractures, and there was nothing left of Grandpa's gift. Grandpa got angry with me, only became somewhat uncommunicative. But Dad, who arrived a few days later, was steaming like a boiling kettle. Dad himself is a pretty strict man. He went through Vietnam, managed to build a business in the coal region in the 80s. And that's almost like Vietnam, by the way. He didn't beat me. He always had a special approach to such things. He sent me for re-education to his service buddy from Vietnam, Uncle Jerry. He lived nearby in the same town. I knew him very superficially, only saw him a few times when we went as a family for barbecues. Uncle Jerry was a real Indian. He could say one word per day. He had several combines and a relatively large farm. That's where I was sent. I remember cleaning pig pens day after day, knee-deep in manure, hauling hay bales, carrying water. They punished me in the most effective, centuries-tested way, with ordinary physical labor. I worked like this for about a month, and then Uncle Jerry started taking me with him on combine rides. He didn't teach me to drive, didn't explain anything. Just sit and sit. So I sat with him for several weeks. He was called an Indian by me not by accident. Besides taciturnity, he had all sorts of tricks. He communicated with the earth, felt the sky, listened to the wind, and so on. But all his tricks didn't affect what happened. We were driving with him as usual. I was just sitting in the combine cabin next to him, looking at the endless yellow fields. Then Uncle Jerry suddenly turned off the engine. This was something new. So for a moment, I even thought the damn machine had broken down, and in the coming days, I wouldn't have to ride with him. But no, Uncle Jerry, who wasn't famous for his talkativeness, suddenly threw out a word sharply, not to me, but to himself: lunch. And this despite the fact that during work we never ate. Personally, I ate at home before work, and when he ate was unknown. Along with this phrase, he pulled his huge Panama hat down on my head, so that all visibility was lost behind its wide brims. Then I wanted to ask him what was wrong, and I asked, "What's that?" His face somehow changed sharply. He started pacing back and forth and nervously scratching his head. "Don't sit in the sun. Go behind the combine. Sit there." He hurriedly shoved me behind the combine and also looked around nervously on all sides. "Uncle Jerry, what shade?" "It's on the other side," I said, and wanted to go around the combine. But Uncle Jerry held me by the arm and pulled me back. "Here, stand here and don't think about sticking out," Uncle Jerry said very dryly, and again began to behave strangely, peeking out from behind the combine, shifting from foot to foot. Still not quite understanding what was happening, I had to obey. Uncle Jerry's sharp change, his strange behavior, and the absurd situation scared me a little. Some anxiety was transmitted from him. He behaved very atypically for me, even began to seem that he was having Vietnam flashbacks, and it seemed to him that we had fallen into an ambush, and he would start shooting at the enemy with an imaginary machine gun, and so on, until I had any ideas about what was happening. Uncle Jerry continued to sometimes crouch from the very edge and peek out from behind the combine, sometimes start digging the ground for no clear reason. He behaved very strangely, and then he generally started praying, not "Our Father," but some incomprehensible mumbling. I felt so uncomfortable that while he was praying and digging the ground, I took and looked around. There was nothing suspicious, field as field. To the horizon, a uniform yellow color. Behind it, at the edge of the horizon, were rural plantings that we called forest. In the sky lay a couple of torn clouds that seemed to have fallen behind their cloud herd and were torn by something unknown. And here my gaze caught on something that rose above the yellow plain, even rectangular edges of gray color. "What are you doing?" Uncle Jerry seemed to scream through his teeth. "Where are you climbing? I told you to sit and not stick out." "But what is that, Uncle Jerry? What's happening at all?" I sincerely didn't understand. "Graveyard people," Uncle Jerry spoke in thermonuclear Spanglish, which is impossible to reproduce. And his graveyard people, he said about a dozen times with such emphasis, as if this should mean something to me. "Who are the graveyard people, Uncle Jerry?" "You can't look at them, you hear. If graveyard people come, you need to return home as quickly as possible," Uncle Jerry said. "There are many of them. Yes, if you see one, it means there's another somewhere. And others," at his word others, my stomach started churning. He immediately started spinning in place and looking in all directions. He pressed the Panama hat on my head even harder, which already covered half my visibility. Earlier on the horizon, I had only managed to see the edges of the rectangle in the clean field. There had been nothing like this here before. We had driven here repeatedly, and now this is there. "I see another one," said Uncle Jerry, and only then did I want to raise my head as he again tilted it down. "You can't look at them." Already in me, on top of fear, something played, and I threw out with anger, "Well, you're looking." But I said then, and here the real hell began, until inside me hundreds of different feelings were raging, most of which were different variations of fear. Uncle Jerry began to dig the ground like crazy. Now he wasn't ceremonious, did it primitively, as if fighting for life. His huge working hands tore out whole pieces of heterogeneous mass roots and earthen crumbs. The heat mixed with earthen dust that rose was intoxicating. I began to seem that I was remembering something very important, something familiar. Meanwhile, Uncle Jerry dug a small hole and began pouring all the drinking water we usually took with us for the day into it. What he was doing was no longer like his usual Indian tricks, like listening to the wind and feeling the sky. This gave off, frankly speaking, if not shamanism, then some kind of devil worship. He began mixing the earth that he diluted with water and smearing this earthy dough on himself. "Come on, faster. Smear yourself all over." A generous handful of strange mass landed on my head. Uncle Jerry quickly tore the Panama hat off me, smeared my face. Faster. His anxiety was transmitted to me too. And as if competing with him, I began to smear myself as quickly as possible. Quickly having smeared himself with the earthy mass, he began sprinkling himself with dry earth and grain stalks, throwing handfuls at me every other time. In a few minutes, we turned into terrible figures covered with earth, roots, and torn straw, behind which human outlines could barely be read. Lie face down in the earth, and whatever happens, whatever you hear, don't move until I say so. In his voice slipped some cold and terrible notes, behind which terrible frames of pain and suffering flashed in my consciousness. These visions overlapped with the current moment, and the whole situation, the whole day that seemed would never end, began to run an icy blade along my solar plexus. This touched, then went lower, as if dancing on my body like a whirlwind walking in the wind, chaotically, and at the same time always the same. Some familiar symbols, like infinity signs. These patterns changed as the external noise around us intensified, uncharacteristic of fields and wastelands. The icy blade began to cut my body when something heavy that was pressing down vegetation floated in our direction behind the combine. Something very heavy. This unpleasant sound, similar to rolling a watermelon from above, slowly approached and noticeably intensified. There was something rhythmic in it, far from natural. To this terrible sound was added another one, somewhere to the right. With the same noise of a watermelon rolling, barely perceptible deep steps were felt, stuck as if in mud. Steps in the earth, as if something was walking inside the earth like in water. Uncle Jerry lay ahead of me, not making any sound. He merged with the earth. This came easily to him. It seemed he had been doing this all his life. But I was torn apart by the feelings that had surged. Probably feelings is too loudly said, because besides fear and anxiety, I didn't get to feel anything else in those moments. Maybe when something heavy hit the combine, this fear forced me to raise my head. Looking in that direction, it seems I even managed to notice a piece of a huge, too large for a human, head, as if someone was lifting it, And then Uncle Jerry pressed my stupid head to the ground with all his force so that my nose started kissing the ground, so that it became dark in my eyes, and merry white lights and red dots danced on the sides of the darkness. And then my lips went numb, and again it seemed to me that I was remembering something very important. Together with these feelings, my body was pierced by spasm-like waves. My legs were cramping, and something like a tight ice collar was pressing from my neck to my tailbone. Behind all this, before my eyes stood a picture of a huge head sticking out of the ground like an animal's. A muddy, dirty color, not earthy, slimy, moldy, dead. A bald head with rare and thick, like pig hair in places. In some places this hair was like hedgehog needles, in some places like plucked feathers. In holes, dents, and stones that had grown in. A head whose face was in the earth, rising, and behind it like a hump was a thick monolith of a gravestone. I managed to come to my senses, not when everything ended, but when this someone was crawling past my legs. Feeling the lifting of the earth with my body, I pressed myself even more. Before my eyes continued to stand the picture of a huge, terrible, and unnatural head, behind which towered a tombstone. Uncle Jerry's hand pressing on my head came to help my compression from fear. Then the third sound began to approach from Uncle Jerry's side. It seemed they were walking toward each other. Their slow approach soon stopped, and it seemed all three of them froze in front of the combine. The silence lasted, by my feelings, an entire eternity, until a shadow didn't appear from our side of the combine. With its arrival, simultaneously, all three sounds began to move away, until they disappeared from hearing range. As soon as they left, I wanted to immediately jump up and run as fast as I could. I even started to raise my head, but Uncle Jerry's hand didn't fall. He also said nothing, so we continued to lie for several more hours, maybe more. During this time, my tongue and throat became somehow prickly, and my body barely perceptibly pulsed with dry pain. Uncle Jerry continued to press my head to the ground. I had a fair question. What are we waiting for? Not risking to ask, I still continued to lie, hoping for a miracle. But instead of it, another already familiar hubbub began, the fourth sound that wasn't heard earlier. Another rolling of a watermelon through grass, behind which something was sinking and moving inside the earth. Along with it came another portion of horror. This beast was circling around us like a shark. I'm sure that if I had had to listen to it for at least another hour, I wouldn't have remained silent, would have jumped up and rushed into the embrace of a huge tombstone. And no iron hands of Uncle Jerry could have held me back. As my clouding increased, the sound began to move away, until it completely merged with the night noise. Uncle Jerry's pressure began to weaken, and we finally got up. With skillful movements, Uncle Jerry jumped into the combine cabin, and somehow turbulently pulled me inside, quickly started the machine, directed it at an angle through other people's fields toward the town. Then I had no strength not only to speak or ask something, I didn't even have the strength to think. I just stared at one point while terrible sounds were ringing in my head. It was necessary for me to swallow a little water when Uncle Jerry, who hadn't calmed down instead of bathing and resting, took a couple of gas cans and dragged me with him on the road, explaining nothing. He brought me to a ravine where he stopped the combine, flew out of the cabin, and began dousing the machine with gasoline from all sides. He told me to do the same. Submitting, I took off all my clothes dirty with earth and threw them inside the cabin. I took out my phone and keys, set them aside. Everything, I say everything, and take off the cross too. Quickly, he was already striking matches, and arguing with him was useless. I did as he said, threw everything inside the cabin, including the shoes, phone, keys, and my hidden pack of Marlboros that Uncle Jerry didn't care about. Is this definitely everything, Uncle Jerry? Uncle Jerry looked at me intently. Definitely, definitely, definitely. After my last words, the match flew into the cabin, and the combine burst into flames. From the burning combine, we immediately headed back to town, and closer to dawn, we were already there. Leading me home, he left without saying goodbye, and I immediately went to the summer shower. There I washed myself with all my might, soaped and rubbed myself with such force that my skin became inflamed with pain, and in my head appeared pictures of ruddy doctor's sausage, washed faces, and heavy earthy hair. When my palms once again rubbed water on my face, something familiar and unpleasant came across my cheek. The ring. I felt disgusted to the point of being twisted. A cheap ring bought in a trading tent. While my thoughts were falling into the abyss of horror, Uncle Jerry came through the gate and talked about something with my grandfather. I felt terribly uncomfortable and terrible. The thoughts revolved around the ring. After we smeared ourselves with earth, it wasn't noticeable. The ring was such a habitual and natural thing for me that it simply wasn't noticed by me in everyday life. All this together played a mean joke on me. While Grandpa was talking to Uncle Jerry on the street, I feverishly thought about what to do, and simply shoved it into a pipe sticking out of the ground. The summer shower was assembled from everything possible: old doors, empty window frames, pieces of iron, and pipes. Similar pipes were not uncommon on Grandpa's plot, sticking out of the ground, and what function they performed was unknown to me. My ring went there. Uncle Jerry was already waiting on the street, washed and in clean clothes. Grandpa, seeing me, went into the house. "Let's go, we need to take a walk," he said, and headed to the gate. On the street, it was just getting light. Somewhere cattle were being driven to graze. Somewhere the first plowmen who had breakfast in the field were making noise. So we walked to the noise from outside, and my anxious silence inside. I had to break the silence. This was the last episode in my memory when Uncle Jerry was so talkative. This was absolutely uncharacteristic of him. Uncle Jerry, what was that at all? Graveyard people. What is that? Why? What you saw is only a small part of what you and I are not given to understand. We call them graveyard people, and they pass without any reasons. But it's better if you saw them to return back as quickly as possible from where you came. And the main thing done by me yesterday is an extreme measure. No one does that. Usually, they're visible from very far away, and on this day no one plows. We usually burn the fields if we see them. But you see how everything grew this year. I'm not the same age anymore. I didn't see it, and when we drove up, it was too late. If graveyard people appear on the horizon, that's how they stand. A month, maybe a little longer, and then they leave for the village. Usually they don't go in, they bypass it. But if you saw graveyard people too late, they start moving. And if they're moving, it means they saw you. And us yesterday they saw, and not just, with anxiety he asked. Saw and not just. Saw and not just, what does that mean? It means we did everything right. The main thing is that everything burned. At his phrase, everything burned, my palm involuntarily clenched, as if trying to cover the ring that was no longer there. And what would have happened if we, for example, hadn't burned all our things? Uncle Jerry looked at me very intently for several seconds, after which he continued. There are different stories here. Of those who regretted and didn't burn their things, I didn't catch them, but I know their stories well. The first was Grandpa Pana's when he returned from the war. He had no foot, was engaged in farming, and encountered graveyard people. Well, I don't know exactly whether they noticed him, or he looked at graveyard people for a long time. They pursued him to the forest itself. Grandpa didn't lose his military dexterity, dug himself into the ground with his prosthetic in a few minutes, lay buried until morning, and returned to the village. He came home, boasted to Grandma, and advised him to burn his clothes. He burned everything but left the prosthetic. A week passed like that, and then he started complaining about pain. Sometimes his back hurt, sometimes his head. He said a hump was growing, and the doctors only shrugged. They found no seals or inflammations under the skin. Sometimes people were walking, and he was lying in a ditch and howling. The hump was growing, the hump was growing, the hump. And then Grandpa started raving. It started seeming to him that graveyard people had grown in his yard. Grandpa had a phenomenal will to live, and soon he brought stones from all over the area to his yard, covered a couple of hectares of his territory with stones and boulders. He laughed, said they'll sprout. Well, what happened next, no one knows exactly. He locked himself inside the house from the inside, nailed the windows with boards, sealed the cracks with clay. He forgot about his pigs and chickens. The pigs ate each other from hunger. Neighbors periodically tried to get to him, approached the house, knocked on doors, and heard only screams. At first hump, hump, and then coffin, coffin. That's how Grandpa Panas started screaming that he was growing a coffin, and no one saw him in order. And he didn't come out of the house at all. It's unknown what he ate. No one saw him for 6 months. And then simply one day, the doors were wide open. People started whispering. They say someone should go and check. And they sent a couple of men. Well, those weren't there for less than a minute, and then everyone, pushing each other, flew out of the house. All 6 months that Grandpa Panas sat at home, he continuously dug the ground and plastered the walls with it. He mixed earth with his feces and smeared his house from the inside with this. People thought maybe he dug and couldn't get out, but at the bottom of the pit inside the hut, they didn't find him. He was found a few days later, 30 miles from the village, with a dead pig tied to his back. Why he did this, where he was going, and how he generally managed to drag it so far is a mystery. He died as such a senseless hunchback. Wow, and where does he live now? There's now a village club. The pit was filled, the house was demolished, and others. In the second story, a man named Igor supposedly looked at the gravestone, or rather, walked around it. You understand, it's not quite a slab. It's always back to us. If you see graveyard people, they can't be back to you. They always appear on the road, that is, the inscriptions on the back. And that same Igor, seeing a gravestone in the field that wasn't there yesterday, scratched his head and went to see what kind of grave it was. And although he knew the story about Grandpa Panas and those unknown to me probably, well, like everyone in our village, he looked. From this, even someone talked to him about it, Someone complained, like, how is it to bury in the middle of a field? And the one to whom he told this later began to bypass Igor by the 10th road and tell everyone that death smells from him. But Igor himself found another trouble. Once in the village hall foyer, he suddenly froze by the mirror and began shouting something like, "Whose hands are these?" Well, people couldn't understand what was wrong. Igor stood by the mirror and, pointing to his reflection, repeated, "Who did this? Who glued it to me there?" Well, they calmed him down, asked what happened. He kept shouting like that and left. A few days he wasn't seen. And then in the village grocery store he appeared, and not just came, but also almost brought the already uneasy saleswomen to fever. They hear noise like doors are being broken. They can't understand what's happening. They look, and their Igor is bursting into the store, and he can't get through the door anymore. He's attached to his back with a mirror. It interferes. They started bringing him to his senses, and he seems not to notice, doesn't understand what's not letting him in. The times were already late Soviet. There they calmed him down and took him away. And he started telling everyone in the psychiatric hospital that he doesn't reflect in the mirror. And then generally started screaming that graveyard people are crawling around the ward. It ended with them finding him dead in the morning. Suffocated. Terrible picture, all twisted, unnaturally. Jaw hung to the side, the whole body was twisted. Uncle Jerry stopped telling about the second case and seemed like I should ask him to tell about the third. But I didn't want to. Although it was dawn, from his stories everything around had changed, became cold and alien. Even such familiar bright and kind sunlight, even it became unpleasant. Then Uncle Jerry continued on his own. Here's the third case. It was already after the collapse of the Union, as it seems to me. It's the most terrible of all. Seemingly then there were still coupons. They hadn't introduced hryvnia yet. Around the local poultry factory, criminal elements were already actively spinning, hoping to privatize it. Then there was generally a time of lawlessness. It was everywhere and didn't bypass our village. Local Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipro criminals started coming to us. They couldn't divide who would pay tribute where. Time passed, arguments became fewer, and when they ended completely, they went to the old good AKs and grenades. There they'll blow up the director. There they'll shoot some appointed accountant of the enterprise on the highway. What, not a day then without a summary? Well, and of course, they also killed each other. Of course, and they also buried each other alive, where such showdowns occur. And it so happened that such guys drove to us under the forest, brought their victim for live burial. They look in the valley gravestone. They drove God knows where. And here's such a thing. Well, the bandits decided to bury him in that grave. They said, like, dig, you'll have your own slab, personal. Well, the one who was unlucky started digging. A few minutes didn't pass, as he howled from horror, jumped to one of the bandits who held him at gunpoint, grabbed that one by the hand with the gun, stuck it in his mouth, and only he fell dead to the ground. The surprised ones started looking at each other, approached the grave. And there's a person with a huge head and gravestone grown into his back looking at them. Well, the first one probably managed to see the face of the one who was in the grave, because he immediately shot himself. And his more careful buddy probably waited and didn't manage to look there, only heard something. Something seemed so terrible to him that he immediately went to the police and confessed. He repeated his testimony like a mantra. again, 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 even when he was no longer being questioned. Well, the police that arrived on his tip found no graves, people with big heads, and gravestones grown into their backs. Only 2 bodies that were later hung on him. They gave him 13 years under the old code, closed him up on bubble. With him, even someone from his buddies tried to establish contact on business trips, sent greetings. But he shut himself off, stopped talking, stopped eating, started behaving so that they could only start looking for him in a triple cell after a few days. Although the triple cell itself was packed with 5 people instead of 3. Here it's like he is, and you hear him, but you don't see him yourself. And this didn't raise questions from anyone. And then once and again he is, and also no questions. Well, in the measure of this, he was drying up without stopping, simply as they say, a bag with bones, 30 kilograms like that. And so this continued, his unnoticed disappearance and the same appearance. Then for New Year, a Kiev cake flew into the cell. And inside the cell, a conflict happened. It lay in the fact that someone put the cake on the gaming table, and the gaming table itself was pulled out to the center of the cell. Well, some didn't understand who constantly moves the table, others who put the cake on it. The latter generally couldn't understand where the hell the second table came from in the cell, which for some reason is called gaming. The question of the latter turned out to be closest to the truth, because the poor guy, no one started looking for him, and about him, no one especially remembered. But for the table, showdowns were every day. It came to the fact that a cadaverous smell appeared in the cell. It smelled like a corpse. Well, at first everyone started sniffing their feet, took out everything they could, turned over every bag, and in the end, they just broke 2 neighboring cells there, so to speak, to the hospital from the stench. They found nothing, the source. The guy also no one was looking for. He wasn't there, but he was everywhere. It ended with the triple from 6-1 person being scattered, and they threw a couple of tuberculosis patients into the cell itself, who were lifted from the hospital. Well, so that no one could settle in it. They brought invalids there, lying and blind. Here's just as one blind grandfather touched the gaming table. He immediately started screaming, not with his own voice. Screaming so that almost a riot started in Bubble. They thought the grandfather was being killed. He screamed not from physical torment. The grandfather felt that something was wrong with the table, that it's not a table in front of him at all, but a person standing on all 4s in a strange pose, long dead and dried up person, imitating a table. Well, the special unit that arrived later took him out only by covering him with a blanket on top. They couldn't straighten him out, so they took him as a table to the morgue. But the story doesn't end there. The pathologists had to supposedly reassemble him, saw him up, and put him back together to bury him like a human. They sewed up seemingly everything. In the morning they come, but there's no one. Hell knows, maybe they also had a new table somewhere that didn't raise questions from anyone. Well, the guy this seemed so scared that he decided to merge with the surrounding world. Well, and as a result, literally became furniture. Crazy, Uncle Jerry said. And how do you think such a thing can even be? I asked rather to change the topic. Once I heard that graveyard people become those who didn't find their death or weren't buried as they should. Their thirst for death is so great that they seem to grow their grave and together with this violate the natural order of things. Well, for what we understand punishes them, and they start wandering the world, carrying their grave as a burden, as a curse. And people are subjected to their either hallucinations or deceptions. And why is this in our village? My great-grandmother told me that behind the fire ravine during the Totters, there was a terrible massacre. There the earth is still places brown. She said that there tens of thousands of people were killed and buried alive. She said that there are still places where the earth cries blood. Well, I don't believe this myself. It doesn't fit. There's something else here, something else. Inside me, two feelings continued to fight. On one hand, I wanted to tell him about the ring, and on the other, there was hope that everything would still pass me by. Trying to be as careful as possible, I still asked, "Uncle Jerry, what will still happen if, for example, forget to burn something?" "Well, here's a cross, for example." Until that moment, atypically talkative and cordial Uncle Jerry sharply became very serious. He grabbed me by the hand and looked intently into my eyes. "Tell me honestly, did you forget something?" I dishonestly said, "No, Uncle Jerry, honestly." His gaze was very heavy. He looked into my eyes for several more seconds and held my hand, and then again changed his face. Before this, he carelessly threw my hand, stepped back as if from a leper, took a step back, froze, and again became that taciturn stone that he had been all my life. "Your father called. He'll come for you at lunch." This was our last conversation, and I never saw Uncle Jerry again in my life. In the 15th year, he burned in his house along with the plot. Dad offered me to go to his funeral, but I had to pretend that I couldn't remember who it was, accompanying this with a feigned, "What, Uncle Jerry?" Let's return to the events of that summer. On the day Dad took me away, and the taciturn grandpa saw me off. Then I was haunted by the question of how you can generally live like this, in anticipation of the fact that something that can simply kill you will appear on the horizon just by the fact of its existence. Grandpa continued to be taciturn, which since that episode with the car. On the way, Dad laughed at my questions, said that these are just one of the Southern scary stories with which they constantly scared each other in the evenings in childhood. But I wasn't very amused. The thought of the ring constantly sat in my head and increasingly found its way to freedom through dreams. In them, Uncle Jerry, graveyard people, and my grandfather somewhere beyond my visibility loudly argued. Their argument was about how long I would manage to live. Grandpa said little, because if I didn't learn to drive such an easy-to-manage machine as a Camry, then what to say about such a complex biological, highly organized apparatus called the human body? On the first turn, I'll fly into the abyss of life and decompose into fertilizers, although some benefit from it will be. Uncle Jerry entered the argument. His voice was somehow muffled and fast, and my mind fell back to that situation when we lay by the combine, pressed face first to the ground. As if he was speaking into that ground, he told behind his fast and muffled words was recognized some plot, like those stories he told before my departure. Only he went somewhere too far from what was making me shiver with that horror that was accompanied by spasms and convulsions. He told how graveyard people would follow me, finding me everywhere until they took theirs. He said this as if my story was already finished, like one of his stories. Then into this mixture of story and argument, graveyard people themselves intervened and began to laugh with the laughter of earth falling into a pit. Only after this, having laughed enough, the graveyard people began to speak. And from fear, I woke up. I never had to go to that southern town again. Grandpa moved to the suburbs in 2 years and lived there until his death. But my terrible expectations only began. I kept waiting for graveyard people, waiting for when they would come for me, waiting and waiting. I told this to my friends, hoping for some argument that would dispel my anxiety forever, and continued to wait. A year passed, nothing happened. No graveyard people appeared on the horizon. In the 10th year, I was again sent for the summer to my grandparents, just to the relatives on my mother's side. They lived in the town of Riverdale, not far from Memphis. I was there so rarely that I had neither friends nor acquaintances there. So instead of trips to the Gulf of Mexico, which was quite nearby, I preferred to spend time at the local pond. Until noon I swam, and then went to the forest that was quite nearby. There I usually sat for several hours while the heat subsided. Here my first meeting with graveyard people happened, in the Riverdale forest in August 2010. Coming to my senses after dozing, it wasn't immediately clear to me what had happened. Above me was some shadow, and my feet rested against something hard. On my middle finger, I felt the familiar pressure. A chill ran through my body as I realized that on my finger was the ring I had thrown into the bottomless pipe several years ago. Then came what for a moment turned my understanding of everything upside down. A voice similar to tearing pieces of grass from the ground began to slowly snake into my consciousness. "You now owe us. We returned this thing to you." This hoarse voice kept saying, repeating the same sounds. I had nothing left but to continue my identical attempts to wake up. Then the shadow above me began to slowly recede and soon disappeared completely. But that same pressure of the ring on my finger didn't go anywhere. I wanted to open my eyes as quickly as possible and throw the damn ring as far away as possible. But the anxiety that graveyard people were still somewhere nearby didn't let me do this. Suddenly, they were waiting for this, when I would make some movement. So I continued to lie motionless, with closed eyes, for several more hours, until I heard voices of people passing by. When gathering all my willpower, I managed to open my eyes. Something worse than the ominous ring from the past was waiting for me. On my right hand, an entire phalanx was missing at the same place where the ring used to be. Seeing this, I started screaming, waiting for pain, but there wasn't any. That part where my finger was missing was covered with a white layer of skin, as if I had lost it very long ago. This wasn't the end of my troubles. Everyone, as one, began to convince me that I hadn't had a finger for 2 years already. And I lost it then at work with Uncle Jerry, when I was getting roots that got stuck in the combine's auger. They said I was lucky that my whole hand wasn't torn off, that after this, I was taken from the village. But I know for sure this didn't happen. They continued to convince me. All as one, friends retold me my story of how I tore off my finger, how I was taken from the village, how I joked with them, showing the phantom finger. But all this definitely didn't happen. Everyone around me, my denial caused irritation. At home, it generally came to quarrels, usually with mention of graveyard people. The conversation ended with me being unwilling to listen to anyone. No one wanted to listen to me. Another year passed, and I turned 18. From my city, I went to study in Nashville. Life was a series of episodes that revolved around weekends, 5 days of study, then a train to my hometown, Saturday and half of Sunday at home, and again, a train back. And so every week. Often halfway home, I read books. The other half, until my very arrival, I listened to music and looked out the window. Maybe then, seeing from the window the cemetery that began after Clarksville. Several slightly atypical graves caught my eye. At first, it seemed to me that I was seeing double. Looking a little closer, I realized what was wrong. These weren't double vision. These were graveyard people. They loomed again on the horizon. They disguised themselves well, almost perfectly. Only their elementary logic, which was obviously alien to them, gave them away. It wasn't enough to just be in a cemetery. You needed to follow its order, sequence. And they just stuck out above other graves, somewhere across the plot, somewhere simply on real graves. Looking a little better, I immediately managed to count 8 graveyard people. Either their number had grown, or there had always been so many. Against the background of the real cemetery, they stood out strongly and looked senseless. I wanted to show this to someone, but my hand didn't rise, and my mouth went dry. The realization came that I shouldn't do this, and all the joy from my observation quickly disappeared. Getting off the train, I looked for more graveyard people on the horizon everywhere, but they weren't there. They didn't appear for several weeks, and then, looking out the dorm window, I saw something rectangular appeared at the bus stop near the tram tracks. At first, I thought it was an advertising banner, but no. It was too familiar to me, what I had to see. Going out of the dorm was scary, and I spent the whole evening just watching this object. I even started keeping records in a notebook, time and presence of the object in the same place. Never thought I had such crooked handwriting. I continued to observe until the last tram, until I saw how what had been motionless by the bus stop all day ended up in the center of an empty tram that slowly hid behind the chestnut leaves that blocked the view from the window. Then, realizing something, I got tired of being afraid. I showed graveyard people my phantom finger and made the last mark in my records. That night I had a dream again. Or maybe it wasn't quite a dream. In the center of my dorm room towered a tombstone. Now the voice was different. Now it was chewing pieces of floorboards and stones. With this falling debris, it spoke about how I still owed them, how they had returned something to me. Horror again lasted almost until morning. The neighbor in the room didn't react to anything. Repeating my identical phrases for the umpteenth time, the voice fell silent, and the slab with unpleasant crunching and cracking sank into the floor. When I opened my eyes, I found with horror that my right hand was missing up to the wrist. There was no scream this time, only shameful, quiet crying. This crying turned into a sob when Mom told me over the phone that I had been missing a hand for a long time, since 2008, when Uncle Jerry and I rode the combine. I was getting roots out of the auger. The records made yesterday were scribbles written with my left hand. I must admit to you, after this I became a very broken person. I almost didn't leave home, avoided others, barely finished college, and started working in a call center. This was before quarantine, remote work, and I was lucky to arrange to work from home even then. So I lived for several years, moved to Nashville, closer to built-up areas, so that the views from my window would be blocked by other buildings. And to be honest, no view was particularly needed by me. My curtains were always closed. I left home very rarely. If I needed to withdraw cash from an ATM or go to the post office. Finally, I reached that state where I could allow myself to paint figurines in my spare time with one hand. This isn't very convenient to do, as is everything else. But gradually, I was getting the hang of living normally. I painted my first, not very expensive set, allocated a whole corner in the hall for this. So the days went work, and a few hours of painting before sleep. Everything was fine. The windows were curtained. I only left home in quick dashes, with a cap on my head and looking at the floor. But this turned out to be not enough. In the evening after work, a new surprise was waiting for me. Instead of my 4 figurines in the hall on the table, were 4 identical tombstones, miniature and maximally detailed, as if someone had been making them for hundreds of hours, old and crafted. In a fit of despair, I swept them to the floor with my stump, fool. At night they came again. Miniature tombstones sticking out of the bed, funny, squeaky voices, merry jingling of mattress springs. They told that I still owed them, and that they had returned something to me. With awakening, I was missing my arm up to the elbow. I no longer called family and friends. I knew they would say that the arm was torn off then on the Combine in 2008. Instead, I asked what I owed them, and what this return was about, where my arm parts disappear. Several more years passed, and my lifestyle rolled to that stage where I no longer cared about anything. Not literally, but I no longer sat huddled in a corner. I went out more often than usual, didn't curtain the windows. I had been deprived of part of my arm up to the shoulder in the second time, and it no longer made me sit in anticipation. I drank morning coffee and looked at the house opposite, and then almost choked on air. In the middle of the neighbor's apartment, in the center of the hall, towered a tombstone. You still owe us. We returned to you. And our days. Since then, they haven't appeared anymore, and I finally understood, it seems. I figured out how this works. Maybe madness speaks in me, or an extreme form of insanity. But here's how I had to understand it. All who previously encountered them couldn't withstand what graveyard people gave them. They couldn't withstand their embodied fears. Graveyard people offered exactly them. Most often, people couldn't withstand what they hid inside their nature. Graveyard people returned what people threw off themselves during their life path. Grandpa Panas was afraid of death, loved earth, wanted to grow a hump during his lifetime that would become his coffin, as if this could help. He starved his livestock to death to be alive in their environment, marked this as a place of death, and wanted to flee from it. He tied a pig corpse to his back, hid behind it, and started running. He ran until he met his death. Igor, who was imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital, panickedly feared something connected with society. Maybe that's why he hid behind a mirror, hoping that, instead of him, people would see their reflection. His suffocation was the result of fears that came all at once. He simply drowned in them, choked, unable to withstand meeting himself. The bandit with a sad fate was so afraid of responsibility that he merged with reality, disguised himself, dissolved in the surrounding environment. He brought himself to the state of furniture. Well, I lived my whole life fearing oblivion, and naturally began to disappear piece by piece. Since 2008, 15 years have passed. I no longer have one arm. It simply disappeared, and everyone, as one, tells me about the combine. How much is this? 10% of the body, 15 more. Uncle Jerry has been dead for a long time. As I said at the beginning, he burned in his house. Grandpa managed to live under Flowerville too. With that village, nothing connects me anymore. But the thought that it was precisely about him constantly spun in my head. So I went there. Impulsively, without any plan, not expecting anything. With a bag in which was a container of cooked buckwheat and a bottle of water. To the field, to where it all began. For 15 years, the village seemed to have dried up. The houses became tiny and the endless fields small. The house where my grandfather used to live was found not from the first time. But that field where everything happened, I saw immediately. I was tired of being afraid, tired of living in fear. 4 rectangles on the horizon were all in the same place and seemed to be waiting for me. At first I walked toward them, then ran, but they remained as far as they were. I wanted to shout to them, "Take what I owe you, enough, take everything." The level of my despair was incredible. There was no strength left to fight. Only senseless agony remained. My running lasted an eternity, while graveyard people mocked me. They also moved away and were already barely visible. My legs got tangled, began to sink into something viscous. Brown earth, fire ravine. There the forces to run ended, and after the fall I lost consciousness. In my dream there were thousands of them. Tens and hundreds of thousands. Buried alive, terrible massacre. Rivers of blood flooded people dumped in the ravine. Blood in which long and blunt human tools were drowning. In this dream, the human flood was moving somewhere. In it were both the living and the dead. It seemed everyone was trying to rise to the very top, and I was one of those who pushed others, walking on human lives. I was the one who almost managed to rise, the one who managed to reach the surface, who almost managed to return from the brown abyss. When consciousness returned to me again, I didn't immediately understand what was holding me. It was the earth. It was holding my hand, the right one that had been disappearing for the last 15 years. With force, I pulled it out, and not believing my eyes, began to examine it. It was covered with dirt, brown slime, blood. The silhouettes of graveyard people that were on the horizon had disappeared. My way back. What happened didn't stop pressing on my head. For the last 15 years, so much had happened that being surprised by this was senseless. I was only afraid that this was another realistic dream. I called Dad, long prepared him for the question, and then asked if he remembered how many hands I had. He just in case asked if I was drinking when I drink, and then still answered that too. Then just as carefully I asked if he remembered why he took me then that summer in 2008. Well, just because, he said quite mundanely over the phone. To my question about graveyard people, he just laughed, said that these were just local children's horror stories. We talked a little more, and my reality was rewritten again. In the conversation, Dad mentioned many things we usually don't talk about. He even remembered how Uncle Jerry drank too much and died. In the people, this is also called burned from the bottle. Although I clearly remember that Uncle Jerry precisely burned along with his plot in the house, and I had to pretend that I didn't particularly remember him in order not to go to the funeral then. When we finally talked, I thought over all possible thoughts in my head, and I can't say that I had more answers. The train showed the same black night pictures outside the window. Occasionally, red lights and white dots flashed on the horizon. Sometimes behind the window, something loomed more than just night, and this was mesmerizing. I didn't want to know if I was crazy or not, didn't want to return to graveyard people, to the question of whether they're real or not, and how real the reality where I am is. There was only one real and obvious desire, to start everything from the beginning, to finally start living, and not wait for something to confront me with a fact. Honestly, I'm tired. I don't know if graveyard people exist, if they change us or reality, if what was what was, or if all this is my delusion. One thing I can say for sure. If you ever see something rectangular or cross-shaped on the horizon while traveling, especially if it wasn't there before, I have advice for you: turn back. The blizzard outside the window was getting stronger. Strong wind twisted the fat snowflakes into small whirlwinds. Inside the house, a tall 6-foot Christmas tree slowly blinked with LED garlands, creating a unique festive mood. The whole room was filled with the pleasant smell of tangerines and delicious dinner. I'm so happy to see you all at this table. It was noticeable that John Peterson was touched. He stood up to make a toast, looked at everyone, and stopped at Wade. Son, I'm proud of you. You finally brought a girl to our home. Let's drink to this. To you, Anna. By the way, how did you two meet? I worked as a waitress for several years in a coffee shop near Wade's house. He often came in the morning for coffee, and we had friendly relations for a long time, but it didn't go further somehow. The girl blushed a little. The attention of all relatives was focused on her. But a few months ago, everything changed. Wade became so attentive to me, we started dating, and he proposed quite quickly. Everything developed rapidly. I hesitated, but he insisted, and finally I said yes. Well, my son just realized he met the right one. Why wait? Kindly smiled Vera Peterson, laying out homemade cake on small, elegant plates. Please, help yourself, Anna. Anna took in her hands a cup of aromatic tea that the woman had placed in front of her and took a few sips. It was delicious, just what was needed. Standard family conversations at the table continued, and Anna relaxed with some relief. She had been worried before meeting her future husband's family, but it seemed the acquaintance had gone well, and everyone had accepted her. Everyone except Tamara, Wade's younger sister. She sat on the other side of the table, almost motionless like a doll. For the entire evening, she ate nothing, almost didn't talk, and her face was pale, even sickly. Vera Peterson nervously bustled around the girl. Anna began to feel the picture losing clarity, and the room seemed to float before her eyes. The porcelain cup she was holding slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor with a clatter. Everything was like in a fog. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the thin figure of 14-year-old Tamara looking at Anna with her black eyes. Bright sun rays breaking through the curtains hit her right in the eyes, making Anna squint. She lay in bed for a long time. Her head was just aching. Her hand reached for the phone lying nearby. Damn, it's already noon. How could I oversleep? Anna quickly grabbed her clothes and ran to the shower. In 20 minutes, she was already going down the stairs from the second floor. Finally, you woke up. Vera Peterson came out of the kitchen where something delicious was smelling. Will you have breakfast? I'm somehow not hungry. From the smell that seemed to fill the whole house, she began to feel like she would vomit in a moment. Well, of course. Next time be a little more careful with homemade wine. You see how strong it turns out with John. Anna was silent, feeling her cheeks redden. But she had only drunk one glass. How could such a thing even happen? The awkward silence was broken by Wade, who crept up from behind, holding some dusty box in his hands. Darling, remember I promised you an unforgettable skating date. Well, here it is. He joyfully smiled, hinting at the contents of the box. I was climbing in the attic and found our old skates. Ice skating. She could hardly skate, but she didn't want to stay in the house either. It was simply embarrassing because of yesterday's incident. Get ready quickly, I'll wait for you outside. He joyfully ran out of the house, slamming the door. Going out into the yard, she understood why Wade had been in such a good mood. Clean white snow crunched pleasantly underfoot. Yesterday night when they arrived, it was already completely dark, and because of the blizzard, you couldn't see the landscape that opened behind the house. A considerable lake. The frozen surface was dusted with snow, and behind it, a high spruce forest that covered the horizon with its white tops. Of course, this isn't the Rockies, but the outskirts of Millbrook are beautiful in their own way. You can't argue with that. Anna tightly pulled the laces on the worn white skates and confidently stood on the ice, trying with all her might to maintain balance. It was a bit awkward for her, because it was noticeable that Wade held himself well on ice, rode backward, did various tricks. Come on, I'll help. Hold on to me. He took her hand and carefully pulled her along further from the shore. I'm a little scared. What if the ice cracks? We'll fall into the water. Nonsense. Look what thick ice. In some places you can even see the bottom. In 15 minutes, Anna felt much more confident. She let go of Wade's hand and even made attempts to skate at a distance from him. I see you're already like a fish in water, or rather like a cow on ice, he laughed. You're doing well. I'll make a circle around the lake and come back. She silently nodded in response, watching how quickly Wade was racing. His skates drew thin lines on the ice. She felt like accelerating well and riding around the lake. Anna pushed off properly and began to gain speed. The wind pleasantly blew in her face. She moved faster and faster. At some point, realizing that she was racing like a whirlwind, she tried to brake as Wade had taught her, but her skates began to cut into the ice with a screech. But whether because of speed or because of clumsiness, Anna fell, painfully hitting her knee. Wade, seeing the fall, turned back toward her. She made an attempt to get up, but suddenly noticed something strange on the bottom of the lake. Looking closely at what was visible through the ice, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her knee hurt badly, but she wasn't reacting, staring down at her feet. Do you see this? See what? He asked with surprise, glancing at the same place. There's a piece of skeleton at the bottom. It seemed to her that Wade turned a little pale, but already in a moment, his face had a smile. This is funny, it's just an ordinary dry branch. No, look, there's the arm and fingers. I can see it. It seemed his loud laughter echoed throughout the entire lake. Anna literally felt her cheeks cover with crimson from shame. She looked at the ice once more. Maybe he was right. Imagination, as always, played a mean joke on her. You know, I've already had enough skating. From yesterday's evening, I want to smoke. Why didn't you smoke earlier? You understand, I don't want the parents to know about my bad habit. I want them to like me. She left Wade alone to skate on the lake and went down the forest road. Having walked away well from the house, she lit a cigarette, inhaling the frosty air mixed with the taste of tobacco. She immersed herself in thoughts and didn't immediately notice the woman in an old fur coat and colorful headscarf who quietly approached her. "You're probably not local, right? Came to visit for the holidays. Beautiful here. Quiet. That only seems so to you at first glance. And who did you come to visit? Not to the Petersons by any chance." Her curiosity didn't surprise Anna. She had lived in a village for several years with her grandmother after her parents died, and there were always plenty of such specimens there. Good that at least someone comes to visit them, because they've become such hermits in recent years. And people say different things. They believe they've completely lost their minds, started believing in all sorts of devilry, running to fortune tellers. But it's not surprising after that tragedy that happened. Anna became quite tense from these words. She was just about to ask the woman a question when they heard soft snow crunching behind them. "Honey, it's time for us to go back." Wade gently hugged his fiancée, not reacting at all to the woman's presence. "So this is your new girlfriend, Wade." Wade's face changed, but he ignored the woman's question. "Goodbye, Alice," he said coldly. That was their only conversation, and why she said new girlfriend. Anna asked Wade only one question on the way to the house. "Don't pay attention to the words of old gossips," Wade replied calmly. But she managed to notice how his face twisted into an angry grimace. Several small logs were slowly burning in the brick fireplace, slightly crackling and warming hands that had become stiff from cold. Although the walk wasn't long, she had gotten quite cold in the frost. Bending by the fireplace, Wade threw a few logs and began to blow on the fire with all his might, trying to make it burn stronger. Vera Peterson brought fragrant black coffee, which she poured into cups. "Here, warm up." Her gaze accidentally caught on old family photos neatly arranged on the stone mantelpiece. She looked at each one with interest for a long time, until she came across one where Wade was still a very small, chubby boy about 6 years old. And next to him sat a slightly older girl in a dark dress with a white collar, very similar to Tamara, only smiling with rosy cheeks and long dark hair braided in pigtails. She couldn't help but ask a question that she would later regret greatly. "Who is this girl in the photo next to Wade?" Instead of an answer, there was a long, awkward pause. All color drained from Vera Peterson's face. She simply froze from confusion. Wade looked at Anna with an angry glare. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to upset you," she began hesitantly. "Probably I should have been told earlier." Vera Peterson slowly sat in an armchair and began. "I remember that sunny day like it's happening now. There had been a good snowfall then. Frost hit hard, and the ice on the lake hadn't had time to freeze properly yet." She sadly looked at the smiling girl in the photo and continued. "She was always disobedient, and that day was no exception. She went to play on the lake, tried to make a skating rink there, but the ice was too thin. At some point it cracked, and when they found her, it was already too late. The day her laughter stopped echoing in our house, it seemed to me that something was forever broken. And only with Tamara's appearance did bright colors return to our life." Vera Peterson could no longer hold back. Silent tears flowed down her cheeks. Anna was extremely ashamed, that through her stupidity and thoughtlessness, she had brought her to such a state. The rest of the day, conversations didn't go well. Wade tried to joke, but these attempts came out somehow clumsy. Vera Peterson was taciturn. Only in the evening, when John Peterson returned from fishing, did she cheer up as if nothing had happened. "Maybe I can help you cook something in the kitchen," Anna began uncertainly. "I'll make dumplings or stuffed cabbage. My grandmother taught me. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve after all. We need to maintain traditions." "Thanks, dear, but I have almost everything ready. Besides, our family has its own traditions. You'll see soon." Vera Peterson sincerely smiled and went to the kitchen, from where sounds of clattering dishes could be heard for some time. Slightly fluffing the down pillow, Anna was already preparing for sleep. The day had been emotionally difficult, and she felt tired. Maybe it was the fresh air that affected her like this. "Darling, the tea has already cooled completely." "I completely forgot." Anna took the cup and made a small sip. It had cooled down and turned out to be somewhat bitter. For some reason, she immediately didn't want to drink it. Wade was so caring, it would be a shame to offend him. She carefully poured the contents of the cup into a large flower pot that stood alone on the windowsill, and quickly lay down in bed, wrapping herself in a soft, warm blanket. Sleep came almost immediately. The dream was detailed, disturbing, cold, piercing. Wind barely knocked you down, lifted fluffy snow from the ground, and threw it in your face with force. Anna slowly, almost silently stepped on the smooth, flat surface, surrounded on all sides by forest. Black branches swayed, weaving into an ominous circle. Having reached almost the middle of this strange place, she heard quiet children's laughter that was barely audible through the blizzard. She quickly turned around, but saw only a piece of snowy smooth lake surface lit by dim moonlight. The laughter sounded closer and louder. Anna turned around again. For a moment it seemed to her that a shadow flashed in the distance. The wind swept away tracks, and she could no longer clearly say where the sound was coming from, and where, therefore, having stood in place, she went in the direction from which, in her opinion, the sound was coming. Having walked several dozen meters, she saw the silhouette of a little girl standing motionless in the darkness, looking at Anna and smiling. Her long black hair fluttered from sharp gusts of wind. This was exactly that girl from the photo. Anna recognized her. She was even dressed in the same dark dress with a white collar. She laughed, but this time, her children's laughter sounded ominous. The girl firmly grabbed Anna's hand so that she felt sharp pain. It seemed her wrists were being burned by red-hot coal. Anna tried with all her might to break free, but couldn't. And when she raised her eyes, she saw that before her was no longer that girl with a chubby, rosy face. It seemed the mask had fallen, and before her was a skeleton covered with pale, withered skin in tattered, dirty clothes. The girl looked at Anna with black, lifeless eyes and laughing said, "You're next." At this moment, a light crack was heard. Anna initially thought her clothes had torn when she jerked her hand, trying to break free. She didn't immediately realize that the ice under her feet had cracked. Only for a moment did Anna feel her body plunging into icy water. She tried to get to the surface, take a breath, but everything was in vain. The girl didn't let go of her hand and pulled her to the bottom. The light before her eyes dimmed and then disappeared completely, immersing her in impenetrable darkness. Waking up in a warm, soft bed, She greedily gulped air with her mouth. It still seemed to her that she was suffocating. The nightmare had been too realistic. Wiping cold sweat from her forehead, she sat in the darkness for a few minutes trying to calm down, not immediately realizing that the bed next to her was empty. She reached for the nightstand where her phone lay. 3:47 a.m. Her hand hurt as if from a burn. Realizing that she wouldn't be able to fall asleep quickly, Anna turned on the flashlight on her phone. When its light fell on her wrist, she couldn't believe her eyes. Dark purple bruises encircled her arm in the place where the girl from the dream had held her. It became really scary. She wanted Wade to calm her, find some rational explanation for this. She quickly got dressed and slowly went down the stairs, trying not to make noise. Already on the way to the kitchen, it seemed to her that a shadow flashed outside the window. She managed to make out a tall figure walking toward the lake Wade. But where was he going at night? And most importantly, why? The feeling that something strange was happening didn't give her peace. Anna threw on a jacket and, holding the door carefully, ran out after him. But they treacherously slammed a little louder than she hoped. Running was damn hard. Steam escaped from her mouth. Her feet slipped on the slippery ice covered with snow. She got quite tired and generally began to doubt whether she had really seen him. How long had she been running like this? 10 to 15 minutes. What a fool she was after all. If he really had gone here, she would have caught up with him already. He couldn't have just dissolved into thin air. She stopped to catch her breath a little. Ahead was the forest, dark and frightening. Going there alone at night was madness. Turning around, the girl noticed that lights were on in the house. She needed to go back. Because of her stupid antics, she risked getting seriously sick. Already halfway back, she began to feel her fingers going numb, and the frost was burning her cheeks painfully. Entering the house, she immediately ran to the kitchen to make hot tea to warm up a little. She hadn't managed to take a few small sips when the front door loudly creaked. A loud conversation was heard. "Well, you're an idiot. You can't be trusted with anything. You messed up everything." But I checked. The cup was empty. She drank everything. And if it really had been so, then we wouldn't have had to look for her in the middle of the night. "Everything's ruined." Vera Peterson's sobbing was heard somewhere in the depths of the house. "Look what you've brought Mother to. If we catch your girlfriend, you'll let the air out of her yourself, understand?" Anna simply didn't want to believe the words she had just heard. Realizing that something really bad was happening, Anna grabbed a small serrated knife that lay on the counter and hid it in her pocket. Waiting for everyone to disperse, she began to slowly make her way to the exit. When her attention was drawn to a quiet moan that came from slightly open doors, curiosity got the better of common sense, and she carefully looked inside the dark room. Her heart contracted with horror. Little Tamara sat tied to a chair. She looked even worse than that time when Anna had seen her last. On the pale child's body were noticeable dark purple bruises. From under black disheveled hair that covered part of her face, abundant tears flowed. "Wait, I'll free you now." The girl tried with all her might to cut the thick rope with a knife, but it turned out to be quite dull. Having almost finished with the bindings, she suddenly felt sharp pain in the back of her head. Everything that was before her eyes became cloudy and blurred, immersing her in solid darkness. Anna came to her senses in a small, stuffy room. A sharp smell of herbs and soot from candles that stood around her hit her nose. She jerked, trying to get up, but felt the rope painfully cutting into her wrists. "Don't jerk so much. You'll ruin everything." Vera Peterson tore open the packaging of a strange system and inserted a needle into the vein on her arm. "What are you going to do to me? Just take your blood for Tamara." "But why? Why don't you take her to a doctor? She's sick." "Traditional medicine can't help her anymore. Many years ago she drowned in the lake, but I found a way to bring her back. True, only for a year. Then I periodically need a girl who will give her life to Tamara." Anna watched in horror as her blood slowly flowed down the thin tube into a transparent plastic container. Unconscious, Tamara was tied up. She really looked lifeless, as if life had been sucked out of her. "The police will look for me. You can't do this to people. You're not needed by anyone. No one even knows you're here. You know how many girls like you are lying at the bottom of this lake? John has already cut a hole for you. He'll throw you into the water at night, tie something heavy to your feet, and you'll never be found." Anna wanted to say something in response, but words suddenly became a heavy lump in the middle of her throat, not finding a way out. She felt small tears treacherously flowing down her cheeks, betraying her fear. Wade entered the room. He looked away, trying not to look Anna in the eyes, feeling guilty. "Wade, let me go, please." He looked at her. "Sorry, but I can't otherwise. If I let you go, Tamara will die forever. Mom won't survive this again. But she's already dead, and I'm alive. She'll live another year, and then another and another." Damn Satanists. Vera Peterson unpacked a blood transfusion system, and with a sharp movement, inserted a needle into the arm of unconscious Tamara. From the sharp pain, the girl woke up, sharply jerking her arm. "Time to start. Get the book, Wade." Wade silently pulled out a tattered tome wrapped in cloth and began carefully turning manuscript pages, looking for what he needed. While he was concentrating on the book, Anna watched mesmerized as Tamara's body began to change. The skinny arms became even longer, but were no longer tender. Sharp claws appeared on thin fingers. Black strands of hair that covered part of her face concealed eyes that were already burning with hellish lights and staring at Anna. Anna jerked with all her strength, pulling the needle out of her vein. From the impact, one of the candles fell on the book. The yellowed paper began to blacken and curl. While Wade tried to extinguish the flame, the creature that was in Tamara's body managed to tear the remaining rope. Anna didn't even have time to blink, as the creature grabbed Vera Peterson's throat with its claws. She frantically beat them, tearing the woman's body. Deep scratches gushed blood abundantly. Wade momentarily froze and then rushed at the creature, trying to push it away. "Tamara, what have you done?" She threw an angry, contemptuous look at Wade and struck him with all her force with her claws across his torso. From the strong push, he fell to the ground with a crash, holding his stomach, writhing in pain. Wade pressed his bloody palms to the wound. The disgusting metallic smell of blood mixed with smoke that filled the room. The flames were already beginning to spread to the curtains. Anna tried to break free, but in vain. She could only helplessly watch as the creature, having grabbed with sharp teeth into Vera Peterson's throat, thirstily drank her blood. The woman quietly gasped, no longer able to scream or even speak. Wade tried to get up, but in vain. Having given up useless attempts, he crawled toward the exit, leaving bloody traces behind him. The door was already close, but he didn't manage to reach the handle. Having finished with Vera Peterson, the creature caught up with him. With force, she turned Wade over and threw him to the ground so that you could hear his bones breaking. He resisted, trying to push the creature away, but it was useless. She beat him with her claws, leaving deep wounds on his body. Leaning over his body, the creature greedily grabbed his bloody throat with her teeth and began to drink blood with disgusting smacking. When the creature finished, Wade was already dead. Anna sat motionless, trying to hold back cough from acrid smoke. She understood that in any case, she would die in this damned house. Either the creature would tear her apart, or she would simply die when the flames burned stronger. The creature threw a sharp look at her and slowly began to approach. Anna closed her eyes from fear. She felt the suffocating smell of rot hit her face. At this moment, it seemed to her that time slowed down, and her whole life flashed before her eyes. And then came another sensation that hit her hard on the arms. She was afraid to open her eyes, and when she dared, she saw that the rope that held her was torn and the creature had disappeared. Covering her nose and mouth with her hands, Anna quickly ran outside. Behind her came gray smoke, but the fire somehow didn't engulf the entire house, only a small part of it. It seemed it was just smoldering. She greedily inhaled the fresh, frosty air, feeling her lungs full of soot. Somewhere in the distance, from the direction of the lake, a man's scream was heard, shrill death cry. She immediately recognized this voice, only for a moment, then silence. Fat snowflakes slowly fell to the ground. Anna completely froze, peering into the darkness. She saw only how the treetops around the lake quietly swayed in the wind. No other movement. Not understanding what to do next, she stood helplessly on the street until she heard soft snow crunching behind her. The same woman in a colorful headscarf approached her. "Come quickly to my place. It's dangerous to stand here." Already in the warm house, when she was handed hot tea and warmed up a little, the woman began the conversation. "My God, what happened? I don't even know where to start. You simply won't believe me." The woman looked intently into Anna's eyes. "You know, I've seen enough here already." She hesitated a little and began her story. "You understand, many years ago the Peterson family bought this house for a very low price. And although it had a bad reputation, they just laughed at these superstitions. Until a few months later, trouble happened with Tamara. Generally, accidents often happen near the lake, but I know that they were dragged down by a creature that lives in the lake. I once saw it with my own eyes. So Vera performed some ritual to bring Tamara back to life, but she did something wrong. Along with Tamara, a creature returned to our world. When young girls in our area began disappearing every year, I began to understand what was happening. Why didn't you go to the police and tell everything? Who would have believed me? But now it's all over. Tamara didn't want such a life, and now she's free." The woman laughed. "Free? Only the creature that for years craved blood but was locked in a little girl's body is free. Now it will get it in abundance." Anna took a few more sips of tea, and suddenly began to feel the room floating before her eyes. The last thing she saw before plunging into darkness was the blurred figure of the woman smiling. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.